I just made an entire series about how to make a Redstone computer from scratch, starting from the very beginning by designing an ALU and registers, all the way to programming a game on it, like Tetris. So if you've watched this series already, there's nothing new here. But if you haven't, then sit back, relax, and enjoy learning how to make a Redstone computer. Hi guys, and welcome to the first episode of a brand new series, Building a Redstone Computer. The ultimate goal for this series is to take you along with me as we make a programmable Redstone computer, powerful enough to run complex programs like Snake, Tetris, and more. And hopefully, along the way, you won't just learn about Redstone, you'll also learn a lot about computers and digital logic in general. But first, let's back up for a second. Why make a computer in the first place? If you've played around with Redstone before, you'll know that you can use it to make digital circuits within the game of Minecraft. And most circuits you'll see, whether they're on YouTube, Reddit, or wherever, are single-purpose circuits, meaning they only do one main thing. A light switch, a binary counter, or even an adder are all examples of single-purpose circuits. In fact, you could even argue that the Redstone games I've made, like Tetris, Snake, and Flappy Bird, are also single-purpose circuits. Sure, they're extremely complex, but they only run one thing. My Tetris game, for example, only runs Tetris. You can't modify it to run anything else, at least not very easily. So in this series, we're going to change our way of thinking. The larger goal is not to make a circuit that does one thing, but instead to make a general purpose circuit, or more accurately, a general purpose computer. But wait, if it's possible to make a computer that can just play any game or run any program, then why haven't I done this earlier? Why did I spend 3 years making games when I could have just done this all along? Well, like anything in computer science, there are trade-offs. Computers are great, but they're extremely slow, like orders of magnitude slower than Redstone games. Maybe 1,000 times slower or more, depending on the computer and what you're doing with it. Redstone games are faster because you can optimize for the task and use creative solutions. For example, when I made Flappy Bird, I used a decaying signal strength circuit to make the bird fall in real time. Think of it this way. If your goal is to play a bunch of games using only Redstone, you have two options. Option 1, make each game with a single-purpose circuit, and they'll be somewhat fast. This is what I've done on my channel a lot, and each game took me anywhere from a couple days to a couple weeks to make. Or option 2, spend a ton of time making a complex, general-purpose computer. I did this recently, and it took me 3 months to do. But now that it's done, making games for it is easy, because you can just program them. An experienced programmer could code something as complicated as Tetris in like a day. So option 2 is what we're going to be doing in this series. We're going to make that initial investment to make a complex computer. That way when we want to make a new game, we can program it in a day instead of building it in a few weeks. So now that we have the motivation, why are we doing this in Minecraft? I think a lot of people would tell you that if you want to make a computer, you should just use a digital logic simulator like Logism, or make one in real life on a breadboard. And I want to be super clear, I don't disagree with that. However, I think Minecraft is a pretty good way to do it too. The 3D nature of Minecraft makes it feel like you're physically in the world of the circuits. I mean, I'd be lying if I said there wasn't some nostalgia keeping me playing as well, but I swear it actually is a decent simulator. Plus, computer tutorials in Logism or on breadboards already exist, so why not do something unique, right? Now let's talk about what you need to know before we start this series. The first and most important thing is to watch my previous tutorial series, Logical Redstone Reloaded. This series will introduce you to binary, logic gates, and a bunch of fundamental circuits that are going to be really important for our computer. I'm going to try my best to recap stuff whenever it's brought up, but still, I highly recommend watching Logical Redstone Reloaded so that you can get familiar with fundamental circuits and concepts. Another thing I recommend, especially if you're planning on making your own computer, is to get familiar with fabric mods. The most common mods I'll be using are World Edit to help with building, Carpet to speed up the game, and Redstone Tools for a bunch of other utility commands. I'm also going to be using a tool called MCHPRS to run Redstone super fast, but that's more complicated than a fabric mod, so you don't have to worry about that right now. For now, I've left a bunch of links in the description for how to install the 3 fabric mods and how to use them. Also, this entire series will be in version 1.18.2 because that's the version the computer was built in. I know that 1.21 has some useful new commands and features, but the computer was built in 1.18.2, so I'm just gonna stick to that version to make sure there's no issues. Plus, at the time of recording this, Redstone Tools still isn't updated to 1.21. Okay, almost done yapping. The last thing I want to say before getting started is just some disclaimers. I am not an expert on computers. I am a recent college graduate who has never done real-life electronics. I've only done software projects and obviously a lot of Minecraft. So I'm probably going to be a biased learning source because the best way to do something in Minecraft might not be the best way to do it in real life. However, this series will still teach you a lot that applies to real life, and I think I have a ton of useful information to offer. Also, there is unlimited freedom when building a computer. Every design choice is a matter of pros and cons. There is almost never a single correct answer when building any part of it. So if you want to make your own computer, play around with these choices. By doing so, you'll learn much more than just copying me. Plus, this series is not going to be a block-by-block tutorial, so it's really not intended for copying me. Instead, I recommend using this series to simply learn about computers, and then with that knowledge, make your own. Alright, let's finally get started. Earlier, I mentioned that our computer will be able to do anything, but what does that actually mean? Back in 1936, a mathematician and computer scientist named Alan Turing thought about this question a lot. He was one of the first people to wonder what a machine that could compute anything might actually look like. And so he created the first mathematical model that could do this, the Turing machine. The Turing machine is basically an infinitely long memory tape divided into cells and a head that always points to one of these cells. Then, based on a set of states, the head will either write to the cell, move left or right, or halt computation. Turing proved mathematically that even with this incredibly simple design, a Turing machine could indeed compute anything, from calculating the digits of pi to running Minecraft. Okay, but why does this matter? Well, if you were making a computer and wanted to prove that it could compute anything, how would you do it? One way to do it is to just ask, can your computer simulate a Turing machine? If so, then yes, your computer can also compute anything. Because anything you could possibly want to do, you can just do on the simulated Turing machine. Any model that can simulate a Turing machine is called Turing complete. So a Turing machine itself is Turing complete, virtually all programming languages are Turing complete, and the computer you're watching this on is also Turing complete. And when it comes to Minecraft computers, they tend to be so simple that they're not always Turing complete. Our computer, though, definitely will be. I'm not going to be proving it, though, or talking any more about it, really. I just thought it was a good thing to bring up. A lot of times when someone makes a new computer, the first question people ask is it Turing complete? So now you know what that is. Alright, enough talk about theory. What is our computer actually going to look like? Well, here's a diagram of all the hardware. These are almost all the things we're going to build with Redstone. Depending on how much you've seen before, you might not understand everything here, or maybe nothing at all, and that's completely okay. By the end of this series, you'll understand all of this diagram and why it looks like this. For now, let's just talk about some of the key features. These rectangular colored blocks are the main components. Each one has one or more inputs, with the arrows going into it, and outputs with the arrows going out of it. For example, this right here is the ALU, which stands for Arithmetic Logic Unit. The ALU will be doing most of the actual computation in our computer. It has two 8-bit inputs, an 8-bit output, and a setting input. If the inputs are 1 and 2, and the setting is add, then the output is 3. We'll talk a lot more about ALUs in the next episode, so it's okay to think about this as a magical black box right now. The main point is that the ALU is a combinational component. Remember from LRR number 6, combinational means that there's no memory or state. It's simply a function from input to output. So when we put in 1, 2, and add, there was no question what the output was going to be. The output was predetermined to be 3. Now let's look at a component that isn't combinational. This is the PC, or program counter. It has a main input, a main output, and a special input called clock. The job of the program counter is to hold a single number in its memory. So let's say it's holding a 7 right now. If I input a different number, like 3, nothing will happen. But if I hold that 3 and send a pulse to this clock input, then it will refresh its memory with the new number. So the clock input allows you to choose when the program counter should update. We'll go over why the program counter holds a single number in later episodes, but the point is, the output depends on what's in the memory. So it's not a combinational component. Instead, it's a sequential component. In this diagram, if a component has a clock input, it's sequential, and if it doesn't, it's combinational. That is not true in all diagrams, but it's true in this one. Alright, so like I said, this is all the hardware, and it's what we're going to be building in Redstone. But that's only part of the story. We're also going to be writing software for the computer. Specifically, we're going to be writing programs in a custom language. But why write programs in a custom language? Why not program in a language that already exists, like C++? Well, you could do that, but it would be more complicated. Before you can run a C++ program on a computer, it gets compiled to an assembly program, which is basically a new version of the program that's easier for the computer to understand. Then the assembly program gets assembled to machine code, and that's what actually gets run on a computer. The compiling stage is complicated, and it's out of scope for this series, so we're going to forget about compiling. Instead, we're going to make a language in this realm. So when I say custom language, I really mean custom assembly language. It's going to take on a similar syntax and feeling as a real assembly language, but it'll be simplified because this is a Minecraft computer. Then to run a program, we're going to assemble it to machine code, which in our case is just a Minecraft schematic of zeros and ones. And once that schematic is pasted into the computer, we can run the program. Alright, that was a lot, so let's summarize. Throughout this series, we're going to be building a programmable Redstone computer that has a lot of hardware, most of which is in this diagram. Some components are combinational, but others are sequential and rely on a clock signal. On top of that, we're going to develop a custom assembly language to write programs in. And to run a program, we'll assemble it to a Minecraft schematic that can be pasted into the computer. This is a very broad overview, and we're going to dive into a lot more detail coming up. Hi guys, and welcome back to Let's Make a Redstone Computer. In the previous episode, I gave you a very brief overview. I showed you a diagram of the full computer, and I said we're going to make a custom assembly language to write programs in. Today, I want to start by expanding on that overview because I didn't give a lot of detail, and then we're going to spend the entire rest of the episode focusing on the first component, the ALU. I hope you enjoy. So, like I said before, we're going to eventually write programs in a custom language. But what does that language actually look like? Well, every program will be a list of instructions, where each instruction is a small task for the computer to do. You can think of our computer like a chef in a kitchen. When it runs a program, it's following a recipe. If step 1 says to put flour in a bowl, then that's the first thing it does. After step 1 is done, it moves on to step 2, which might be turning on the oven. The point is, a program is just a straightforward list of instructions from top to bottom. So in the hardware, the first thing we need is something to physically store the program. That's the job of the instruction memory. Memory address 0 will store the first instruction, address 1 will store the next one, etc. We also need something to keep track of which instruction the computer is executing. Introducing the program counter. The program counter stores the address of the instruction we're currently on. So it'll start at 0 and count up by 1 every time an instruction is completed. Then we have the ALU, which is going to be the star of this video. The ALU will be doing most of the computation, like addition, subtraction, and bitwise logic. But who cares about computation if you have nowhere to store the numbers? Introducing the data memory, which is a giant memory bank that allows us to read and write data to whatever address we want. Then we have the register file, which is like a mini version of the data memory. The register file is a small collection of registers where each register holds a single number. And finally, we have the call stack, which allows us to create functions in our program. We're going to be going through each of these components in way more detail later, but here's what I want you to take away from this. All of these components have different jobs, but they all work together with one common goal: perform the instruction. Now that we know a little bit more about the hardware and software, let's dissect a simple program. Consider this program with 4 instructions. Again, programs are written in our custom language, so what I'm about to say doesn't necessarily apply to every language you see, only this one. First is LDI R12. LDI stands for load immediate, so this instruction is telling us to load register 1 with a 2. Let's go ahead and do that. Then we have LDI R22, so this time we load register 2 with a 2. Then we have add R1, R2, R3. This means add the contents of register 1 and register 2 together and put them into register 3. So register 3 is going to receive a 4. Finally, HLT means halt, which just tells the computer to halt, or stop the program. In Python, you could write the program like this. They're not exactly the same, because in Python, R1, R2, and R3 are variables, not registers, but hopefully this shows you intuitively what the program is doing. And over the next few episodes, we're going to be building up the hardware to actually run this. Alright, let's move on to the main topic of this video, the ALU. ALU stands for Arithmetic Logic Unit, and like I said in episode 1, the ALU will be doing most of the actual computation in our computer. So what kinds of computation are the most useful? I don't know about you guys, but the first thing I think of is addition. Addition is super useful. I mean, it's the classic example of computation. In my opinion, the easiest way to do addition is with a carry cancel adder, as seen in LRR number 4. This is an 8-bit CCA, so you can put in any 2 8-bit numbers here, like 6 and 4, and you'll get the 8-bit result, which is 10. You can also do subtraction with an adder, as seen in LRR number 5. If you invert the B input and add 1, then it performs A minus B. In this circuit right here, I used torches to invert B, and I turned on the carry in to add 1. 6 minus 4 is 2. So let's make our ALU capable of both addition and subtraction. In general, addition and subtraction are the main kinds of arithmetic you'll see in ALUs. But what about logic? Why is that word there too? Well, another useful set of operations is called bitwise logic. Bitwise logic means to look at each pair of bits individually and apply some logical operation to them. So for example, a bitwise AND between 0101 and 0011 would result in 0001. Each pair of bits just follows the AND function. One reason bitwise operations are so useful is because they allow us to control individual bits using bit masks. For example, if you want to set the first bit of a number to 1 and leave the rest unchanged, you can OR it with the mask 0001. In Redstone, you can do bitwise logic by just building the logic gate at every level. This right here is a bitwise OR, so if at least one of the lamps are 1 at any level, then that lamp will also be 1 on the output. This is a bitwise AND, and it's the same idea. 101 and 011 gives 1. So these 6 circuits are the 6 main kinds of bitwise logic: OR, AND, XOR, NOR, NAND, XNOR. You might have noticed that I'm missing the NOT operation, and that's because NOT takes 1 input instead of 2. So we're just not going to worry about it right now. Putting this all together, let's make an ALU that has all 8 functions: addition, subtraction, and 6 kinds of bitwise logic. We can do this by duplicating the input to every function and then selecting one output at a time. This circuit here duplicates A into all the A inputs and then does the same thing for B by passing it through the A line. So if you input 5 and 3, that 5 and 3 gets put into every single function. Then I have comparators on every output, with each one being cancelled by a tower of repeaters. So depending on what operation you want to do, you can just uncancel that tower. If you go down here and select subtraction, then you get 5 minus 3, which is 2. The ALU still technically computed everything else, but since the subtraction result was the only one that got uncancelled, it was the only one that got to the output. As another example, if you select XOR, you get the XOR result, 110. So yeah, this is a fully working ALU. You can input any two 8-bit numbers and choose from 8 different operations. If you're making your own computer and want the absolute easiest way to make an ALU, then this is what I recommend. It's pretty straightforward, and you can add or remove operations without too much work. As you might have guessed though, this is not the most optimized way to make an ALU. Even if you were just doing addition and subtraction, you don't technically need 2 separate adders. As seen in LRR number 5, you can modify an adder to make it add or subtract. When this lever is off, it's just a normal adder, and when it's on, it inverts B and adds 1 using the carry-in, which of course makes it subtract. So is it possible to make even more modifications to put in the bitwise functions as well? To really get a good understanding of what modifications we need to make, let's go all the way back to a single full adder, as seen in LRR number 4. Here we have A, B, carry in, carry out, and sum. According to the truth table, the sum is on when either 1 or 3 of the inputs are on. One way to detect that is with A XOR B XOR C, and that's exactly what this full adder is doing. Using this lime green design for an XOR gate, it computes A XOR B, which then wiggles up here into another XOR gate with C, the carry in. So the final sum is A XOR B XOR C. Then for the carry out, it should be on when at least 2 of the inputs are on. One equation for this is A and B, or A XOR B and C. In other words, either both A and B are on, or one of them is on and so is C. This full adder implements that equation in a really clever way. Notice that this XOR design gives you an AND gate for free with a torch on the top. So this first torch is actually the result of A and B. And this second torch is a similar story. This is the AND between the result of the first XOR, A XOR B, and C. These 2 torches get ORed with a dust line, which gives you this final equation, the carryout. And as a refresher, this full adder can be duplicated to make a ripple carry adder of any size. This one right here is a 4-bit ripple carry adder, so it can add any 2 4-bit numbers. 2 plus 3, for example, is 5. Okay, now let's start modifying this. We know from earlier that if you invert B and turn on the carry-in, you can do subtraction. So let's add those 2 control signals. Here I added the control for invert B, so when I flip this lever, you can see that B goes from 0011 to 1100, and this is the carry-in right here. So now if you turn both of these on, it computes 5 minus 3, which is 2. While we're at it, let's also add a control signal for invert A. This doesn't do much for us right now, but it's really easy to add and it can't hurt. Let's also make a little chart to keep track of which control signals we have and which functions we can do. The black wool is 0 and the white wool is 1. So right now the chart is saying that if everything is 0, it adds, and if invert B and carry in are 1, it subtracts. So now the question is, how can we modify this even further to do bitwise logic? Well, maybe it helps to ask a different question. Why is this not doing bitwise logic? I think the biggest reason is because we have these carry signals propagating across the adder. They make one full adder affect the others, which is not what you want for a bitwise operation. To combat this, let's try forcing all the carry-ins to be 1. I'll use 4 torches underneath like this, all connected to a single line called flood carry. When flood carry is on, all the carry-ins are set to 1. So what happens if you turn on flood carry and nothing else? You actually get bitwise XNOR. 0101 XNOR 0011 is 1001. Remember, all the sum bits are doing A XOR B XOR C, but flood carry forces all the C's to be 1, and an XOR with 1 is the same thing as an inversion. And also, you can do bitwise XOR by just inverting one of the inputs. This works because if you invert one of the inputs of XNOR, it inverts the output and becomes XOR. So now we have 4 functions. Add is nothing, subtract is invert B and carry in, XNOR is flood carry, and XOR is invert B and flood carry. Okay, we've got some bitwise logic now, but we still need OR, NOR, AND, and NAND. That sounds like a lot, but I'd argue these 4 functions are actually pretty similar. They can all be made with an OR gate as a base and different combinations of inversions. OR is no inversions, NOR is inverting the output, AND is inverting the output and the inputs, and NAND is just inverting the inputs. So if we can make another modification to somehow put in an OR gate, we might be able to create all 4 of these functions. As it turns out, there's a really easy way to do that. If you go to the first XOR and power this dust, it becomes an OR instead. And importantly, it also disables this torch, the first AND gate of the carryout. This is a very small detail, but it's actually necessary for this modification to work. Disabling that torch means the carryout equation changes from this to this, and that makes the carries behave a lot differently. Because now, as long as the first carry in is 0, then the first carry out will also be 0, which then means the next carry out will also be 0, and so on and so on. All the carries end up being 0. So not only does this new control line change the first XOR to an OR, it also forces all the carries to be 0. Let's call this new control line XOR to OR, and now we can add all the remaining functions. OR, NOR, AND, and NAND all have the XOR to OR control signal turned on, and each one just uses some different inversions. OR uses no inversions, NOR uses flood carry, which remember inverts the output, AND uses flood carry, invert A, and invert B, and NAND just uses invert A and invert B. Let's see some of these in action. For a bitwise AND, we need XOR to OR, flood carry, invert A, and invert B. 0101 and 0011 is 0001. For a bitwise NOR, we need XOR to OR and flood carry. 0101 NOR 0011 is 1000. By the way, as a cool bonus, you can actually make implies as well. Implies is not as common, but it's basically a function that says if A, then B. And if you add flood carry to it, it becomes nimplies, the negation of implies. So now, with just 5 control signals, we've created an ALU that can do addition, subtraction, and 8 kinds of bitwise logic. You can even make a nice ROM, or read-only memory, to automate the settings if you get tired of looking at the table. These lines have the control signals baked into them, so if I choose subtract, for example, it'll automatically turn on invert B and Cin with these torches. Very cool. Now let's see if we can improve this even further by applying the same logic to an 8-bit CCA. As a refresher from LRR number 4, a CCA calculates the sum in the exact same way as the last adder. There's an XOR gate on the front to calculate A XOR B, and then that comes along here and gets XOR'd with C. But unlike the last adder, a CCA generates all the carries in parallel using a tower of comparators. So let's start with the easiest control signal, the carry in. On a CCA, you can make a carry in by just powering the carry tower from the bottom. That's it. The next easiest control signals are inverting A and inverting B. These can both be done with some inverters on the front, just like on the last adder. This lever inverts A, and this lever inverts B. Next, let's do flood carry. For this, I just made a tower of repeaters that forces all the carries to be 1 in that final XOR. And finally, we need the XOR to OR control signal. Notice that on this XOR design, you can easily get the OR by just taking out this dust. So I just took that dust and wired it to the output. Now when this comparator is uncancelled, it overrides the output with the OR, thus turning this XOR into an OR. And that is pretty much it. You can put in any two 8-bit numbers and choose from 10 different functions using the table. And since these 5 control signals behave the same way as before, you can use the exact same ROM for it too. As a quick test, putting in this number or this number gives us all ones. Beautiful. Okay, so there's actually one more thing that this ALU is going to need, a shifting function. Shifting bits is extremely useful. One reason is because shifting a binary number left multiplies it by 2, while shifting it right divides it by 2. So let's make our ALU capable of both shifting to the left and right. The cool thing is, our ALU can kind of already do a shift to the left. For example, to shift a 3 to the left, you can just put it on both A and B and add them, because x plus x is 2x. This gives 6, which is the same thing as 3 shifted left. But our ALU definitely can't shift to the right, so let's add that function. To do this, I'll split the output into 2 parts, one for the regular output and one for the right shifted output. And then this control signal will either allow the regular output if it's 0, or allow the right shifted output if it's 1. So now if you put in a 6 and turn on right shift, it shifts down to a 3. The nice thing about doing the shift on the end like this is that technically you could combine it with another operation. For example, you could do 1 0 0 or 1 0, which gives you this, and then right shift the result as well. But that's just a fun sidetrack. Our ALU will only do one operation at a time. Hi guys, and welcome back to Let's Make a Redstone Computer. In the previous episode, we created the ALU, a device to perform operations on numbers. Today, we're going to dive into the world of memory and build a fully working dual-read register file. I hope you enjoy. But first, let's get more specific about which ALU design we're going to use. In the last episode, I showed you 3 main designs for an ALU. A simple design, where you just allow one output at a time, and a more complicated design with 2 versions. This one is for a ripple carry adder, and this one is for a carry cancel adder. For our computer, we're going to use this last one, the carry cancel adder design. I like this one the best because the inputs are vertical and it's pretty small. Going to a diagram form, this is our computer so far. All we have is the ALU. D1 and D2 are the 2 8-bit inputs, which I referred to as A and B in the last episode. The setting input is one of these 11 operations that our ALU can do, and the output is the 8-bit result. Remember, this is a combinational component, because once you put in the inputs, the output is already predetermined. You could even make a truth table with every possible combination, but it would be thousands of lines long. So an ALU can definitely do a lot on its own, but it's still pretty limited. The only expressions it can evaluate are ones that have 2 numbers, like 5 plus 6 or 2 XOR 3. What if you wanted to evaluate an expression with more than 2 numbers, like 1 plus 4 plus 7 for example? Well, even though you can't do it in one step, you can still do it, right? Just add 1 plus 4, which gives 5, and then add that 5 to 7, which gives 12. You only operated on 2 numbers at a time, but since you remembered the 5 and brought it back, you could still finish the evaluation. Using this same technique, you could evaluate an expression of any size, as long as you had enough memory to store the intermediate results. So let's start building some memory with Redstone, because it seems like it would be kinda useful. In LRR number 7, I showed you guys that repeater locks are a great way to make memory, because they act as a natural data latch. All you have to do to write a bit is unlock it and relock it. To write a 1, just put a 1 behind it, and unlock, relock. Or to write a 0, it's the same idea. Using a stone button like this works fine, but it's actually a lot longer than it needs to be. You only need a minimum of a 2-tick pulse, which you can get from a 2-tick pulse generator. This gives just enough time to write the new data. One repeater lock only stores a single bit though, so how would you store more information? The easiest solution is to just use more of them. Here I have 4 repeater locks all hooked up to the same write line. So you can put in any number, like 0101, press write, and the whole thing gets written. This is called a register. A register just stores a number, and it's usually made with a bunch of data latches. Specifically, this is a 4-bit register because you can store any 4-bit number to it. And although making horizontal registers works fine, in my opinion, it's more elegant to do it vertically. This is an 8-bit register with all 8 repeater locks stacked directly on top of each other. I say this is more elegant because now the right line is just one glass tower that reaches all 8 at once. So you can put in any 8-bit number and write it. If you want to write a new number, then you can just put it back here and write again. Now let's take this even further and combine multiple registers together. Here I took 4 registers and combined all the inputs into one main input right here. So if you put in a number, it gets duplicated to all of them. Then you can just press write on the register you want to write to. For example, to write a 5 to the second register, just put a 5 here, go to the second register, and press write. As you can see, it received a 5. The only downside with this circuit is that you can't write to multiple registers at once. But in our case, that's okay. Remember, the overall job of the computer is to execute simple instructions, so it's actually going to be better to write to one register at a time. Next, let's give these registers some official names, because calling them by the second one or the third one is kind of annoying. I'll call this one on the left register 0, then register 1, register 2, and register 3. And now that each one has a number, we can use a decoder from LRR number 6 to address them. This is a 2 to 4 decoder, meaning it takes in a 2-bit binary number, 0, 1, 2, or 3, and turns on the corresponding output. If you put in 1, it decodes to 1, or if you put in 2, it decodes to 2. A decoder outputs a constant signal though, so if you just hook this up to the right lines, it makes the selected register constantly open. Notice how if you put a 3 into this decoder, it comes over here, gets decoded for, and keeps register 3 completely unlocked. It would be really nice if, instead of this, we could wait for a button press to write to the register that we put in the decoder. One way to do this is to just cancel the input until the button is pressed. So now when you press write, the address gets released for 2 ticks, and you get the output for 2 ticks. For example, if you put in a 1 and press write, you get a 2-tick pulse on 1. Or if you put in a 3 and press write, you get a 2-tick pulse on 3. But as you might have noticed already, there's a subtle problem with this. Canceling the address is the same thing as setting the address to 0. But 0 is a perfectly valid address, so the decoder is just going to constantly output 0 while it's canceled. Furthermore, since the decoder decodes for all possible combinations, there's no address we can put in to make it output nothing. To solve this problem, there are a few different approaches, and we're going to choose the most naive one. We're just going to remove register 0. So instead of registers 0, 1, 2, and 3, we'll just have 1, 2, and 3. And now all of them are off by default until we choose 1, 2, or 3 and press write. Let's go ahead and hook this up and try it out. I'll put in a 4, select register 1, and press write. Then I'll put in a 5, select register 2, and press write again. And it worked. Register 1 got a 4, and register 2 got a 5. Okay, now that we can write to a specific address, it would make sense to read a specific address as well. To do this, I'm going to wire all the outputs together and put in another decoder to only allow one of them at a time. So when you put an address here, only that register's output will be allowed, and it'll show up on this output. I just filled the registers with these numbers, so let's try reading them. Reading 3 gives 6, reading 2 gives 5, and reading 1 gives 4. But what about address 0? What happens if you try to read that? Well, it looks like it outputs 0, because it decodes to nothing. We removed the physical copy of register 0. However, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Register 0 actually does exist if you think about it as only reading 0. This is called a 0 register. So instead of thinking of this as decoding to nothing, think of it as decoding for register 0, which happens to be a 0 register. Also, notice that if you write to register 0, the data doesn't get stored anywhere. It essentially just gets thrown out. That makes sense, because why would you write to it if it's just going to read 0 no matter what? Now, having a 0 register might sound stupid, but we'll see later on that it's actually going to be pretty useful. But anyways, this is now a fully working register file. A register file is just a collection of registers with the ability to write to any of them or read from any of them. Specifically, this register file has 4 registers, 0, 1, 2, and 3, with 0 being a 0 register. If you're making your own computer and want the simplest design possible for a register file, then this is what I recommend. But this wouldn't be a video about register files without talking about one of the most common features, dual read. Dual read is the ability to read 2 registers at once. In hardware, there are 2 main strategies to do this: true dual read and simulated dual read. In true dual read, you basically just duplicate all the output wires and read each one separately. So in this example, you can see that it lets you read register 1 with one set of wires and register 2 with the other set. In simulated dual read, you instead keep 2 copies of the registers and then just read each copy normally. To read registers 1 and 2, for example, just read 1 on the first copy and 2 on the second. Note that since you have 2 copies now, this means you have to keep them in sync. One easy way to do that is to just write to both copies whenever you execute a write. So with Redstone, here's an example of true dual read. There's only 1 copy of the registers, but the output wiring gets really messy. There are 2 read decoders now, so you can put in any 2 addresses here and read them both at once. And then here's an example of simulated dual read. Simulated dual read is actually a lot easier to make with Redstone because you can basically just mirror the entire circuit to make the copy. This is the first copy of registers 1, 2, and 3, and this is the other copy. It's symmetrical. To keep them in sync, the write decoder now writes to both copies at once with this Redstone line. So if you write to register 1, for example, you can see that both register 1s receive a write signal perfectly in sync. And then there are just 2 separate read decoders, one on each side. So you can read any register here and any register here. Alright, now let's build the register file that we're actually going to use in our computer. Again, if you just want the simplest design, I recommend this. But the one we're going to use is going to be a bit fancier because it'll take advantage of some smart Redstone tricks. We'll start by using this clever design for the write function. If you didn't know, you can also lock repeaters with a comparator. So what we have here are comparators with signal strength 1 locking every repeater. And when you power this glass tower, it cancels all of them from the side, which unlocks the entire register. This design is great because it can be stacked every 2 blocks, as long as you stagger them like this. Let's give our register file a total of 16 registers, 0 through 15, with 0 being a 0 register. Then for the read function, we're going to use another clever design. Notice that you can create a read function with just 2 inversions. Right now the output is reading the input because the double inversion cancels out, but if you want to stop reading, you can just power it here, which forces it to be off. This design uses that strategy, but just in a fancier way. The first inversion is done with these comparators, and the second inversion is done with these torches. When the glass tower is powered, it forces all the torches to be off and stops reading the register. Just like how over here, powering the dust stops reading the bit. But when it's not powered, any comparators that are on will have a signal strength of 2, which is just barely enough to only affect one output and get inverted again. For example, right now there's a 5 in the register, but the glass tower is being powered, so it's not being read. To read it, you just unpower the glass tower, and you can see that the comparators just barely reach their outputs and read a 5. This probably seems like the most overcomplicated read function in the world, and it is, but it's all for a reason. It's all to make it too wide stackable, using the staggering technique again. So let's go ahead and add this to all 16 registers. Now let's add some decoders. Since there are 16 registers, we can address them using some 4-bit decoders. Here's the write decoder with the write button already hooked up, and here's the read decoder. And finally, let's mirror this entire thing to make it simulated dual read. Now the write decoder is hooked up to both copies, and there are 2 read decoders, one on each side. And that's it. This is the final register file. 16 8-bit registers, dual read, and register 0 is a 0 register. In diagram form, the register file looks like this. R1 and R2 are the 2 read addresses, and these are the 2 outputs. W is the write address, and data is the 8-bit data you want to write. Now, remember in episode 1 when I said that sequential components will update using the clock signal? Well, the write button I've been using this whole time is what updates the register file. It literally controls when the register values change. So the write button is the clock signal. I've just been calling it a different name. The only thing we don't have from this diagram is the enable input. When enable is 1, it behaves the exact same way I showed you in Minecraft so far. But when enable is 0, you can't read from it or write to it. It's completely disabled. This will be a really useful feature later on, so let's go ahead and add this signal to the Minecraft build. The nice thing is, it's pretty simple to completely disable this. You can do it by just canceling all 3 of the address inputs. This forces it to read register 0 on both read ports, which again, always outputs 0, and it forces any writes to register 0, which just get thrown away. So now when this lever is off, it's disabled, and when it's on, it's enabled. And just like that, we are completely matching the diagram. Here's R1, R2, W, data, clock, enable, and the 2 outputs which are on the other side. Let's go through some final examples to make this really solid. I'll put the diagram on screen too. Everything is 0 right now, including the enable signal, so let's start by enabling it. Then I'll put in a 7 for data, a 1 for the write address, and press clock. This writes a 7 to register 1. On the first port, reading address 1 reads 7, and on the second port, reading address 1 also reads 7. Now let's change the data to 4, the write address to 2, and press clock. This writes a 4 to register 2. Switching the first read port to 2 will switch the first output to 4, and switching the second read port to 2 will switch the second output to 4. And then if we disable it, both outputs switch to 0. Note that the registers aren't reset or anything, it's just reading and writing is disabled. If you enable it later, you can continue where you left off. Hi guys, and welcome back to Let's Make a Redstone Computer. In the last episode, we made a register file. Today is a big day. We're going to transition from just components to something that you could actually call a computer. Let's recap what we've done in this series so far. I started off by saying it would be nice to compute things, and I built an ALU. It takes in two 8-bit numbers and an operation, and outputs an 8-bit result. Then I talked about how memory is nice too, and I built a register file. It has two read addresses, a write address, a data input, an enable signal, a clock signal, and two outputs. If you don't remember how any of these signals work, I recommend rewatching the end of the last episode. On their own though, both of these components are limited. The ALU can only do single operations, like 1 plus 2 or 3 XOR 4. It can't evaluate a bigger expression like this. And the register file can store things, but that's it. It can't do any computation. So let's combine them. I'll plug the two outputs of the register file into the two inputs of the ALU, and I'll plug the output of the ALU back into the register file. So now, when you read two registers, the ALU will immediately perform an operation on them, and the result is ready to be written back to any register. For example, let's say I want to add register 1 with register 2 and put the result into register 3. I'll just manually put a 7 and 8 into these registers to start off. To do this, I'll start by enabling the register file and reading registers 1 and 2. This makes it output 7 and 8, which immediately go into the ALU. By default, the ALU is already adding them together because that's what happens when the control bits are 0. So 7 plus 8, or 15, is coming out of here, and it's going back into the register file. All I have to do now is put in 3 for the write address, press clock, and just like that, register 3 gets a 15. Let's look at this circuit in diagram form to be even more clear. Remember, all the arrows going into this are the inputs. There are 3 regular inputs, read address 1, read address 2, and write address, which are each 4 bits. And there are 2 of these blue control inputs, the enable for the register file, which is 1 bit, and the operation for the ALU, which is 6 bits. Remember, using 6 different control signals, we can make this ALU do lots of different operations. So here's what I just did in Redstone. I put in a 7 and an 8 manually, I enabled the register file, put in a 1 and a 2 to read, put in 3 as a destination, and pressed clock to execute it. By the way, the addresses put in don't have to be different from each other. For example, you can do something weird like subtract register 1 from register 1 and put the result back into register 1. Just input 1 and 1 to read, enable the register file, put in the control bits for subtract, put in 1 as a destination, and press clock. 7 minus 7 is 0, so register 1 received a 0. Also, notice that you don't have to put in the inputs one by one. You can put them all in at the same time. For example, to execute this, you can put in the 7, 8, 9, enable, and the bits for XOR all at once. As long as you wait long enough for the result to come back around before pressing clock, the instruction gets executed. Alright, now that our computer is capable of some pretty cool things, let's start thinking about how to program it. If you remember from episode 1, our eventual goal is for the computer to execute an instruction, where an instruction is just some binary string. Then we'll be able to write a program by creating a list of instructions. So what should our instructions actually look like? This is the part of computer architecture where there is so much freedom. There are unlimited ways to design instructions. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use a system that I was taught in school, because it served me well and it seems to be a pretty common way to do it. First things first, every instruction will be the exact same length, 16 bits. This just makes things simpler and more consistent. Now notice that there are 2 kinds of inputs on our computer, the control inputs on the bottom and the regular inputs. The control inputs are called that because they control what the components are fundamentally doing. For the register file, the enable signal controls whether it updates or not. And for the ALU, these 6 bits control what operation it's doing. So I'm going to call the first 4 bits of the instruction the operation code, or opcode, and this will determine which control bits are on. To do this, I'm going to introduce a new component called a control ROM. The control ROM takes in the opcode as input and turns on whatever control bits are on for that opcode. For example, maybe for opcode 0101, you want the computer to enable the register file and subtract on the ALU. The control ROM is completely customizable. Furthermore, you can think of the opcode as the type of the instruction. Since our opcode is 4 bits, we can have a maximum of 16 types of instructions, each with their own unique set of control bits to turn on. Then, the remaining 12 bits will be for the operands, which you can think of as the arguments of the instruction. For now, let's just make the operands directly line up with the remaining inputs on our computer. The first 4 operand bits will line up with read 1, the next 4 with read 2, and the last 4 with write. In reality, the operands are going to be different depending on the opcode, but let's not worry about that right now. So, for example, let's say I want to execute this instruction. The opcode 0011, or 3, will be plugged into the control ROM, and the control bits for 3 will turn on, whatever that ends up being. The next 4 bits, 7, will be plugged into read 1, then 9 will be plugged into read 2, and 5 into write. And finally, I'll send a clock pulse, which executes the instruction. Okay, our instruction set is going to be a lot to keep track of, so let's make a spreadsheet. This 16-bit section will be for describing the format of the instructions. Black is 0 and white is 1. So the first row will describe the format for opcode 0000, all the way down to the last row for opcode 1111. Right now, the operands are the same for every opcode, but that'll change in the future. And then these columns are to keep track of which control bits each opcode will activate. I also have a few extra columns off to the sides to help with note-taking. The mnemonic, which in our case is a 3-letter name for the instruction, the description, which is just for notes in case the mnemonic is not obvious enough, and the pseudocode, where I'll describe exactly what the instruction does in code form. Don't worry if these columns don't make sense yet. As I start to fill this out, hopefully it'll be more clear. Also, if you ever want to look at this spreadsheet yourself, I put it in the description. Now, if I had planned out this series more carefully, I would start with opcode 0, but instead, I'm going to start with opcode 2 and save 0 and 1 for later. Arguably, the simplest thing our computer can do is add. So let's make opcode 2 an add instruction with the mnemonic ADD. In terms of control bits, the register file should be enabled and the ALU should be set up to add. So the control ROM needs a 1 here and 0s here. And for the pseudocode, it's going to add A with B and put it into C. So I'll just write that down. Let's go ahead and execute an add instruction on the diagram to see how it looks. Specifically, let's execute this add instruction. The opcode 2 goes in here, making the control ROM spit out a 1 followed by all zeros. The operands go into their corresponding spots, and when I press clock, it performs the instruction. It added register 1 with register 2 and wrote it to register 3, which is exactly what the pseudocode said it would do. Let's keep going with this. Our computer can also do subtraction, so let's make a subtraction instruction with the mnemonic SUB. Just like add, it has to enable the register file, but this time it also has to turn on invert B and carry-in. On the diagram, let's execute a subtraction instruction. The opcode 3 goes in here, making it spit out a 1 for enable, invert B, and carry-in. The operands go into their correct spots, and when I press clock, it performs the instruction. In this case, it did register 1 minus register 2 and put it into register 3. Following this same pattern, I could make 6 more instructions for these 6 kinds of bitwise logic, but that's kind of a lot. So instead, I'm just going to make one for NOR, AND, and XOR. Don't worry, the computer will still be able to do all kinds of bitwise logic, it just might take more than one instruction to do it. More on that later in the series. To execute any of these, it looks extremely similar to add or subtract. Opcode goes in here, operands go in here, and press clock. Finally, I'll make a right shift instruction. Right shift is special because it's only applied to A, not A and B, so I'm going to have to remove the B operand. Specifically, in the right shift instruction, these 4 bits will be all zeros. When it's executed, it'll right shift A and put it into C. On the diagram, here's what a right shift looks like. Alright, now that we've got 6 finished instructions, we can write a real program. For example, let's write a program that executes this pseudocode. Starting on the first line, the opcode for add is 2, and in this case, the operands are 1 for A, 1 for B, and 2 for C. Then the opcode for XOR is 6, and the operands are 1, 2, and 3. The opcode for right shift is 7, and the operands are 2 for A and 2 for C. The remaining 4 bits are forced to be 0. And there we go, that's the program. If you executed these 3 instructions on the computer, it would execute this pseudocode. This notation, where every instruction is a binary string, is called machine code. It's called that because, in a way, it's the code for the machine. It's literally the exact 1s and 0s that the computer receives. But the problem is, for humans, machine code is really hard to read. For this small program, it's not too bad, but imagine trying to understand what this program does. So what I'm going to do is make an alternate notation that's a bit easier to program in, called an assembly language. I'm going to refer to opcodes as their 3-letter mnemonic instead. And I'm going to refer to register operands as R followed by that number. Now, in this new assembly language, we can describe machine code in a more human way. It's definitely not amazing, but it's much better than ones and zeros. In order to actually execute this though, it still needs to be converted to machine code. Machine code is still ultimately what the computer needs to run the program. So I made a Python program to convert from our assembly language to machine code. This is called an assembler. As you can see, if I run it with the assembly program, it outputs the corresponding machine code. The details of the assembler are a bit out of scope for this series, but the GitHub is in the description if you want to explore it. One really important thing to note here is that different assembly languages will have different syntax. In our case, for this specific language that I just created right now, I chose to require the opcode first and then the operands after, in order. Notice how add R1, R2, R3 lines up exactly with its assembled instruction. 2, 1, 2, 3. In general, this doesn't have to be the case. You can make an assembler that assembles this statement to that machine code instead. The assembler would just have to swap the order before turning it into ones and zeros. But for us, to keep things as simple as possible, the order of the words in assembly will always match the order of bits in the machine code. And the syntax for assembly instructions will always follow this exact pattern. A 3-letter opcode followed by the operands. Finally back in Minecraft, let's catch up on the diagram. We need to make a control ROM, which remember takes in the 4-bit opcode and outputs the corresponding control bits. To do this, I'll start by making a 4 to 16 decoder. So when you put in the opcode here, like 3, only the line for number 3 will be on and nothing else. Then I'll use torches to set the control bits. According to the spreadsheet, the control bits for add are enable and nothing else. For subtraction, it's enable, carry in, and invert B. And yeah, I won't bore you with the rest of them. The point is that these torches match the control bits in the spreadsheet. If you put in the opcode for XOR, for example, the corresponding torches turn on, and the correct control bits get set. So now, let's run this program from earlier on the real computer. Before we start though, I'll just manually put these numbers into the registers. Okay, now add R1, R1, R2 assembles to 2, 1, 1, 2. So let's put in 2, 1, 1, 2. Execute. XOR R1, R2, R3 assembles to 6, 1, 2, 3. Execute. And right shift R2, R2 assembles to 7, 2, 0, 2. Execute. And there we go. We just assembled and ran a program. The registers now have these numbers in them, which if you execute the pseudocode is exactly right. That was a lot, so let's summarize. In our instruction set, there are now 6 out of 16 instructions. These instructions can be described in 2 different ways. You can describe them in our custom assembly language, where each instruction is a 3-letter opcode followed by the operands, or you can describe them in machine code, which is the binary equivalent. If you write a program in assembly, then you can use the assembler I wrote to convert it to machine code. And once you've done that, you can execute each machine code instruction by doing the following. Plug the opcode into the control ROM, plug the operands into the correct spots, and press clock. Hi guys, and welcome back to Let's Make a Redstone Computer. Things are getting a lot more advanced now. We have a new control ROM and 6 out of 16 instructions in our instruction set. Today, we're going to create a new component to make running a program way easier. Before we make a new component though, I want to start off by introducing a brand new instruction, one that doesn't require any new hardware or anything. It's called no operation, or no-op, with opcode 0 and the mnemonic NOP. No-op literally does nothing. When the computer executes it, none of the memory should change whatsoever. So for the control bits, let's make the enable signal for the register file a 0. That way it doesn't get written to when the instruction is executed. And then it doesn't really matter what the rest of the control bits are, so I'll just write an X for them, meaning they can be 1 or 0. On the diagram, let's execute a no-op. Specifically, this no-op has all zeros for the operands, so in assembly it would be written as no-op R0, R0, R0. And to start off, let's say that this is the data in the register file. The opcode goes in here, which makes it output a 0 for enable, and whatever you want for the rest of them, let's just say 0. The operands go into their spots, and when you press clock, nothing happens, because you can't write to a register file when it's disabled. As another example, let's say the no-op has operands R1, R2, and R3 instead. Opcode goes in here, operands go in here, and once again, executing it does nothing. In fact, nothing even comes out of the register file in the first place, because again, it's disabled. Therefore, it doesn't actually matter what these operand bits are. This is a no-op, but so is this, and so is this. They're all functionally the same. So it's kind of silly to say that no-op has 3 register operands. I mean, you can, but these operands are not relevant to the instruction. To be more accurate, let's gray out the entire operand section to signify that it doesn't matter what these bits are. And then in assembly, let's just write no-op with no operands. Instead of writing it like this or this, we'll just write it as no-op. That's it. The assembler will automatically assemble it to 0000, followed by, well, anything will work. In my assembler, I just made it follow by all zeros. Alright, so in the last episode, we ended off by assembling and running a 3-line program by hand on the real computer. And this worked perfectly. We saw that the registers got updated just like we expected. But this method of putting in machine code manually is really tedious and prone to error. One wrong lever input means you're going to execute the wrong instruction. So let's make a new component to store the program for us. I'll call this component the instruction memory. The instruction memory will hold a list of instructions, each at their own unique address. It's a combinational component that takes an address as input and outputs the instruction at that address. For example, if these instructions are in the instruction memory, then putting in address 0 will output this, or putting in address 1 will output this. So naturally, when we fill the instruction memory with a program, let's make it start at address 0 and count up. Address 0 will store the first instruction, address 1 will store the next one, and so on. Now, the number of bits in the address directly determines how many instructions we can store. If we use a 3-bit address, then we can store up to 8 instructions, because there are 8 combinations of 3 bits, 000 to 111, or 0 to 7. In general, for an n-bit address, we can store up to 2 to the n instructions. So how big should our actual addresses be? This is a really interesting question, because it's a balance of pros and cons. A bigger address means you can fit bigger programs, and therefore do more complex things. But as the instruction memory gets bigger, it also gets slower and laggier. So for our computer, I'm going to make it a 10-bit address, meaning we'll be able to store 2 to the 10 or 1024 instructions. When I made this computer the first time, I found that 1024 was a pretty good balance. It's enough instructions to run crazy things like Tetris, but it's not so big that it makes Minecraft crash. Okay, let's make the instruction memory in Minecraft. The first thing we need is a 10 to 1024 decoder. That way we can put in an address and find the physical location of that instruction. So far in this series, I've always made decoders in one straight line, such as this 4 to 16 decoder. But this design creates some problems when you scale it up to 10 to 1024. The most obvious problem is that it becomes extremely long. So let's make it in a tree formation instead. When you put in the address here, it spreads out and propagates to all the branches of the decoder. This makes the overall footprint more rectangular, and it's also quite a bit faster. But another problem is that it becomes extremely laggy. When you put in the address, it visits thousands of repeaters and torches. So I'm actually using a fancy trick here to help with that. The bottom 4 bits of the address are used to find which branch it's on first, and then the rest of the bits are to find where on that branch. This makes it more efficient and less laggy because instead of searching all the addresses, it only searches on one branch. If that didn't make sense, don't worry, this is just an optimization. It's not super important. Functionally, this is still a normal 10 to 1024 decoder. When you put in the 10-bit address here, the corresponding torch turns on. Now let's build the storage for the instructions. To do this, I'll make a glass tower and a set of 16 blocks with nothing on them. Then you can put repeaters on these blocks wherever the ones are in the instruction. For example, if this is the instruction you want to store, then you can just put a repeater here, 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 and here. And as you can see, when the address is decoded, the instruction comes out. Let's build this setup for every address and OR all the outputs together into one output line. And with that, we have a finished instruction memory. Let's put in some instructions and try it out. I'll just put in the example program from the last episode. Putting in address 0 gives this, address 1 gives this, and address 2 gives this. Also, notice that if I go beyond the program, like to address 3, it outputs all zeros, which is actually still an instruction. It's a no-op. This brings up an interesting point that I want to make sure is very clear. By default, when there are all zeros for every instruction in the memory, it's not that it's empty. It's actually completely full with all no-ops. And when you put in a program, what you're really doing is replacing some of those no-ops with the more interesting instructions of your program. In our case, we just replaced 0, 1, and 2 with these more interesting instructions. Okay, so we have an instruction memory, but it's still a pain to put in the machine code. If anything, we kind of made it worse. Now instead of turning on lamps, we have to fly into the instruction memory and carefully place repeaters. So I'm going to code a part 2 of the assembler, which takes the machine code file and converts it to a Minecraft schematic to paste into the instruction memory. As always, it's in the description if you want to check it out. I used a Python package called mcschematic, created by my friend Sloime. So now, if I run it with this assembly program, it'll assemble it to a machine code file, and then use that to generate a schematic. Then I can go over here, load the schematic, run / paste, and it gets put in. In diagram form, this is what we have now. The instruction memory on the left, and the rest of the computer on the right. So let's go ahead and connect them. From here on out, I'll refer to the leftmost bit of an instruction as bit 15, and the rightmost as bit 0. So, bits 0 to 3 will go into the write address, bits 4 to 7 into read 2, 8 to 11 into read 1, and 12 to 15 go into the control ROM. This is just what we've been doing manually this entire time. By the way, to make the diagrams a little bit cleaner, I'm not going to include the control ROM from here on out, but it is still there and the opcode always goes into it. In Minecraft, let's make these same connections. Here I put 0 to 3 into write, 4 to 7 into read 2, 8 to 11 into read 1, and 12 to 15 into the control ROM. I should also mention that at this point, the real build will start to look a little bit different than the diagram. For example, in Minecraft, the input to the instruction memory is on the right, but on the diagram, it's on the left. And if you make your own computer, you'll probably find yourself doing this too. You'll diagram it one way, but then find out it's easier to build in some other orientation. Just keep in mind that the Minecraft computer and the diagram are equivalent. Throughout this series, they'll always have the exact same inputs, outputs, and connections. So, now that we're matching the diagram, let's run a program. I'll start by assembling this new program and pasting it in. It does 2 adds, a no-op, and a subtraction. And I'll just put these numbers in the register file to start off. First, I'll set the instruction address to 0 so that the first instruction comes out, and I'll press clock to execute it. Then I'll make the address 1 and press clock again, make the address 2, press clock, and make the address 3 and press clock. And just like that, the program was run. The first 4 registers went from 1100 to 3123. If you execute the program by hand, you'll see that that's exactly right. Okay, now we can run programs way more easily. Instead of flipping a bunch of levers every time, we can just paste in the program once and press clock for every address. But there's still a pretty big problem. We can't put new values into the register file without doing it manually. So let's introduce a new instruction. Opcode 8 will be called load immediate with the mnemonic LDI. Load immediate has 2 operands, 4 bits for register A and 8 bits for an immediate value, which is just a number. When it's executed, it will put the immediate into register A. For example, LDI R14 assembles to this, and when it's executed, it will put 4 into register 1. To do this in hardware, we need to plug the bottom 8 bits 0 through 7, into the data input of the register file, because that's where the immediate is on the instruction. But the ALU output is already going into that. So let's introduce a multiplexer, or a mux, which will allow us to choose which input we want to allow through. I showed multiplexers in episode 6 of LRR. When the mux control bit is 0, it will choose the bottom input, which is the output from the ALU. That's what we've been putting in so far. But when the control bit is 1, it will choose the new top input, which is the bottom 8 bits of the instruction. Since we have a new control bit, let's make a new column for it on the spreadsheet. Let's also do some color coding to make this spreadsheet easier to look at. There we go, much better. Also, notice that load immediate puts the value into register A, but on our diagram, register C is the write address, not A. So let's add another mux to let us choose which register should be the destination. When the mux is 0, the destination is register C, which has been the norm so far. But when it's 1, it switches the destination to register A. I'll add this new control bit to the spreadsheet as well. And now we can finally fill in these control bits. Every instruction except for load immediate will put in zeros on these new muxes. Well, except for no-op, which is technically an X because it doesn't matter. Load immediate will put in 1s on these new muxes. Load immediate will also enable the register file, and it doesn't matter what the ALU does. It's not going to end up using it. So, on the diagram, let's execute a program with a load immediate, nice and slowly and in detail. This program has 2 instructions, and all it's going to do is load a register 1 with a 4, and then add 4 plus 4 into register 2. I'll start by putting in instruction address 0 for the first instruction. As this instruction comes out of the instruction memory, these are the bits we get. And remember, even though it's not on the diagram, the opcode 1000 goes into the control ROM. It's a load immediate, so it puts a 1 into these two muxes, enables the register file, and puts in whatever for the ALU. That doesn't matter. Since these two muxes both receive a 1, they both choose the top input. This mux chose 1 for the destination, and this mux chose 4 for the data. So when we press clock, the register file puts a 4 into register 1, and we successfully performed LDI R1 4. Now let's go to the second instruction by putting in instruction address 1. As this instruction comes out, these are the bits we get. And again, not seen on the diagram, the opcode for add goes into the control ROM, which puts in 0s for the muxes, 1 for enable, and 0s on the ALU to make it add. Since these two muxes both receive a 0, they both choose the bottom input, 2 for the destination, and 8 for the data, because that's what's coming out of the ALU. And when we press clock, the register file puts an 8 into register 2. We successfully performed add R1, R1, R2. And that concludes the program. Alright, let's catch up to the diagram and build these two new muxes in Minecraft. Here's the mux for the data input. I just made a tower of comparators on each input. If the control bit is 0, it only allows this tower, and if it's 1, it only allows this tower. And then here's the mux for the destination register. It's the exact same thing. 2 comparator towers with one of them cancelled at all times. Also, I hooked up the muxes to the control ROM and updated it to match the spreadsheet. And now we can run any program with these 8 instructions on the real Minecraft computer. To keep it simple, let's just run the 2-line program from earlier. As always, I'll start by assembling it and pasting it in. Then I'll set the address to 0 and press clock, set the address to 1 and press clock, and register 2 gets an 8. Perfect. Hi guys, and welcome back to Let's Make a Redstone Computer. Last episode, we built an instruction memory, which allows us to store a program in Redstone. Today, we're going to build a new component to make it much easier to run these programs. But first, there are a few things I want to talk about regarding last episode, because I got a lot of questions in the comments. First off, no-op. Some of you guys asked why no-op is even a thing, because it seems like a pointless instruction. Well, no-ops are useful when it comes to the timing and alignment of instructions. Let's say you want instruction B to happen 3 instructions after instruction A, but you don't want anything else to happen in between them. In that case, you can just fill in the space in between with no-ops. In general, as processors get more complex, having complete control over the timing of instructions becomes a lot more useful. Another thing you guys pointed out is that no-op doesn't have to be its own instruction. For example, you could just do add R0, R0, R0. Register 0 can't be written to, so this behaves exactly the same as a no-op. In fact, you could even go a step further and make the assembler assemble the word no-op to add R0, R0, R0 in machine code. Then you could still write it as no-op in assembly, even though it's not technically a real instruction. This is a perfectly valid option, and it would essentially make no-op a pseudo instruction. A pseudo instruction looks like a real instruction in assembly, but it actually isn't. Notice how in this scenario, no-op looks like a real instruction, but in machine code, it's an add. The reason I made no-op a real instruction and not a pseudo instruction is because I feel like it's cleaner and more elegant. It uses another opcode unnecessarily, but I personally think it's worth the sacrifice. And like I've said from the beginning, this series is opinionated, so if you make your own computer, you can obviously make your own decisions. The other thing you guys commented about was the assembler. If you go to the GitHub repo in the description, use the assembler, and paste the schematic in, you'll notice that the bits are completely rearranged. The assembler doesn't work on the world download from last episode. This is because the repo in the description is all based on the final computer, which I actually already finished and made a video about. Throughout this series, what I'm doing is building up this computer a second time, so it's not going to look exactly the same, and thus the assembler might not work. So if you want to run a program for real, you'll have to do it on the final computer. Just go to the repo in the description and follow the instructions on the README. I also have a section on my Discord server dedicated to the computer, so you can go there if you run into any problems. And when it comes to the world downloads of these episodes, I recommend only looking at them as a display. Alright, let's finally get started with today's stuff. The first thing I want to do today is revisit our instruction set. As we continue to add more instructions and make our computer more complicated, this control section is going to get really overwhelming, and it's not the main focus of what I want this series to be about. So I'm just going to remove it. I want it to be obvious enough from the diagram to infer how each instruction is executed. So on that note, let's recap how every instruction so far is executed. No-op looks like this. The register file is not enabled, so nothing gets written and the instruction does nothing. Add looks like this. Registers A and B get read, the ALU adds, and it gets written to register C. Subtract, XOR, AND, NOR, and right shift are all very similar to add, with the only difference being the operation in the ALU. And then load immediate, or LDI, is the new one. The data going into the register file becomes the 8-bit immediate, and the destination becomes register A. So in this example, LDI R27 puts a 7 into register 2. Let's also get a refresher on what our assembly programs look like, without the computer. Here's a simple program that calculates the first 5 Fibonacci numbers. If you didn't know, the Fibonacci sequence starts with 1, 1, and then the next number is the sum of the previous two. So 1 plus 1 is 2, 1 plus 2 is 3, then 5, 8, etc. This program starts by putting a 1 into register 1 and a 1 into register 2. Then it adds R1 plus R2 into R3, 2 plus 3 into 4, and 3 plus 4 into 5. As you can see, when it's over with, register 5 has the 5th Fibonacci number. So as our Minecraft computer stands, we can execute a program by doing the following. Assemble it, paste it in, and go through each address one by one, pressing clock to execute each instruction. But this is tedious, and it always follows the same pattern. So let's make a new component to help automate this, called the program counter. The program counter stores a single number, and its job is to keep track of where we are in the program. Specifically, the number it stores will be the 10-bit address of the instruction that is currently being executed. This output wire just shows what the number is, so if it's currently storing a 7, then the output shows 7, and then the input doesn't really do anything until you press clock. Pressing clock writes the input to the memory. For example, if you put in 3 and press clock, it writes the 3. So the program counter is essentially a single register. In fact, some computers just use one of the registers in the register file as the program counter. For us though, it just makes more sense to keep it separate because it holds a 10-bit number, whereas the register file holds 8-bit numbers. Now, since the address goes up by 1 as you execute a program, let's add 1 to the address and plug it back into the program counter. That way when you press clock, it counts up by 1. Notice how if I start at 0 and start pressing clock, it updates to 1, then 2, then 3, etc. And then let's plug this whole thing into the instruction memory. So now, here's how running a program will work. Let's run this Fibonacci program, for example. We'll start by putting the program into the instruction memory, as normal, and set the program counter to 0. To execute the first instruction, send a clock pulse to both the program counter and the register file. We can do that by connecting them into one button and just pressing that button. Notice that this both executes the first instruction and counts up by 1 on the program counter. So we're already ready to execute the next instruction. You can just press this button 4 more times, and it will automatically execute the next 4 instructions. But even this is still more manual than it needs to be. As you might have guessed, the reason these red signals are called clock is because now we can hook up a clock to it. There's no need to manually press the button 5 times. Let's just reset the computer and have the clock run the program for us. But this creates a new problem. How does the clock know when to stop? We could make it end when it hits the first no-op, but then we couldn't have a program like this, because it would stop before the end. Instead, let's make a new instruction called halt, with opcode 1 and mnemonic HLT. When the computer receives a halt, it will stop the clock, and therefore stop executing instructions. Let's put a halt at the end of the Fibonacci program, reset the computer, and start the clock again. Now it runs the program and automatically stops when it reaches the halt. Beautiful. Alright, let's catch up to the diagram in Minecraft. I'll start by building a program counter. Like I said, it's basically a single register, so it's actually pretty simple. You can just put 10 repeater locks on top of each other, all connected with a clock signal. If you put in 7 for the input and press clock, it writes a 7. Or if you put in 3 and press clock, it writes a 3. Then let's use an adder to add 1 and loop it back into the input. Here I'm using a carry cancel adder, but any adder will work just fine. Now when you press clock, it counts up. 1, 2, 3, etc. By the way, since this whole thing is essentially a counter, I should mention that there are lots of different ways to make redstone counters, and most designs don't even need an adder. For example, in LRR number 8, I showed you guys this tiny design for a counter. It's only 8 bits and not 10 bits, but I feel like it's important to mention here. Again, just check out LRR number 8 if you want to learn more about it. Let's go ahead and plug this whole thing into the instruction memory and reset the program counter to 0. Then for the clock, I'm going to use this circuit right here. When you press the start button, it starts running, and it sends out a 2-tick pulse every 100 redstone ticks, and pressing stop just turns it off. This circuit works by making a comparator cancel itself after a long delay. If you want to learn more about it, then check out LRR number 7. Now let's just hook this up to the clock signals on the program counter and the register file, and let's make it so that when the opcode for halt is detected, it comes over here and stops the clock. Now, I made the clock 100 redstone ticks because I know for sure, without even counting, that 100 ticks is much longer than any instruction could take. So there's no way that the clock is too fast. But it's definitely not as fast as it could be. If you wanted to find the fastest possible clock speed, you would just need to count how long the longest instruction takes and set it to that. This brings up an important point about our computer. Our computer is classified as single cycle because every clock cycle executes exactly one instruction. This is, in my opinion, the simplest way to design a computer. But it has the disadvantage that you are only as strong as your weakest link. The time it takes to execute the longest instruction is the time it has to take to execute any instruction in order to make the clock speed consistent. So even if 99% of your instructions are lightning fast, if you even have one slow one, the clock is slow. In theory, you could make a clock that changes its speed based on the instruction, but this is generally frowned upon because it makes the timings unpredictable. Most computers, both in real life and in Redstone, are not single cycle. Instead, they're multi-cycle, breaking the instructions up into many clock cycles. For example, you can make a computer that breaks instructions up into 3 separate stages. Maybe one to fetch the instruction, another to decode it, and another to perform an operation on the ALU. Whatever they may be, if you break instructions up like this, then the computer would take 3 clock cycles to execute an instruction. Why would you want to do that? Well, it actually allows the computer to work on multiple instructions at once. Notice that after the add instruction moves from stage 1 to stage 2, the computer could also start working on a subtract instruction in stage 1 at the same time. Then as the add moves to stage 3 and the subtract moves to stage 2, it could work on an XOR in stage 1. This is called pipelining, and it's an extremely powerful tool to make computers faster. As you can see by this graph, executing an add, subtract, and XOR with a 3-stage pipeline takes 5 cycles, whereas if you did each instruction individually, it would take 9 cycles, 3 plus 3 plus 3. But again, none of this even matters for our series because our computer is single cycle. There's no pipelining. Every clock cycle executes exactly one full instruction at a time. Alright, now that we're caught up to the diagram and I'm done with that tangent, let's run this Fibonacci program for real. If we built everything right, then all we have to do is assemble it, paste it in, and start the clock. About a minute later, we can see that the clock got stopped by the halt, and the registers have 1, 1, 2, 3, 5 in them. Perfect. Hi guys, and welcome back to Let's Make a Redstone Computer. Last episode, we made a program counter, which keeps track of where we are in the program. Today, we'll be looking at how to make better programs by using jumping and branching. But first, I want to add one more instruction to our instruction set. It's called add immediate, with mnemonic ADI and opcode 9. Add immediate has the exact same operands as load immediate, 4 bits for register A and 8 bits for an immediate value. But instead of putting the value into the register, it adds the value to the register. For example, add immediate R1 3 assembles to this, and when it's executed, it'll add 3 to register 1. If register 1 happens to have a 7 in it, then after executing this, it'll have 10. In hardware, we can execute add immediate by routing the immediate bits, 0 through 7, up and over the register file into the B input of the ALU. But of course, the B input is already taken, so we have to add a multiplexer. Let's execute add immediate R1 3 to see how it looks. And let's say that register 1 has a 7 in it to start off. As the instruction comes out, these are the bits we get. The 7 from register 1 comes out here, the immediate 3 gets selected on this mux, the ALU adds them together to get 10, this mux selects the 10, and this mux selects register 1 to write it back. So register 1 gets a 10. Add immediate is super useful because it makes modifying registers on the fly easier. For example, let's say you want to make a counting program where register 1 increments by 1 3 times. Before add immediate, you would have to do something like this. Put a 1 into another register, like register 2, and then add that to register 1 3 times. But now you don't need another register. You can just increment register 1 directly with add immediate. And incrementing is such a common operation that it's a good idea to make a pseudo instruction for it. Let's make it so that when we type inc R1, inc meaning increment, the assembler translates it to add immediate R1 1 in machine code. In general, typing inc Rx will get translated to add immediate Rx 1. Now our counting program can be written nicely with just 3 increments. And while we're at it, let's also make a decrement pseudo instruction. Notice that if you do add immediate with 255, it makes that register count down by 1. Remember, all registers just hold an 8-bit number. So if you take 5 for example, and add 255, which is all 1s, you'll get this, which without the overflow is 4. Another way to think about this is that working with 8-bit numbers is the same thing as mod 256. 5 plus 255 is 260, mod 256 is 4. So let's make decrement Rx translate to add immediate Rx 255. And now we can increment or decrement any register with these nice pseudo instructions in assembly. In Minecraft, let's catch up to the diagram. I'll take the immediate bits, wrap them around the register file, and put them into a mux with the B input of the ALU. And then I'll just update the control ROM to support add immediate. To test it out, let's run this program. This program sets register 1 to 0, and then adds a 1, 2, and 3 to it. Paste it in, press clock, and about a minute later, there's a 6 in register 1. By the way, I always do a lot more testing than this off camera. I just don't include it because it's kind of boring. If you're making your own computer, I recommend giving new instructions tons and tons of test cases before continuing. So at this point, running a program on our computer is easier than ever. Just paste it into the instruction memory and start the clock. If the program hits a halt, it stops the clock. And throughout the past few episodes, we've seen our computer run basic programs, like this Fibonacci program or this counting program. But what if you wanted to make a program that counts up 100 times instead of 3? Currently, the only way to do that is to physically repeat the counting code 100 times, which is kind of silly, right? A much more efficient strategy would be to just write the code once and then tell the computer how many times to execute it. In almost all other programming languages, you can do this using a loop. In Python, for example, this 2-line code segment will increment x 100 times. So I think it would be really useful to have loops in our assembly language too. It would make it easier to write powerful programs with less lines of code. In order to be able to loop, we need the program counter to somehow jump back up after getting to the bottom of the code. That way it can execute it again and again. So let's introduce a new instruction called jump, with opcode 10 and mnemonic JMP. Jump takes one operand, the 10-bit address. When it's executed, it'll put that address into the program counter. For example, jump 4 assembles to this, and when it's executed, it sets the program counter to 4. In hardware, we can create a jump by taking bits 0 through 9 and plugging them back into the PC. But the current address plus 1 is already going into it, so we'll have to make a mux. So on all instructions except jump, the PC will just count up, but on a jump, it'll receive the new address from the jump instruction. Let's see how jump works in assembly. As always, the program starts by executing the first instruction, which increments register 1. Then it executes jump 0, which puts the PC back to 0. So now, instead of executing address 2, it executes address 0 again. Then it goes to the next instruction, which again jumps back to 0. And yeah, register 1 counts up forever, and the PC never reaches the halt. As another example, let's look at this program. It starts by putting a 0 into register 1, then it jumps to address 3, increments R1, decrements R1, and jumps to address 4, which decrements again, then jumps again, and causes an infinite loop. So this decrements R1 forever. The PC never reaches the halt, and it also never reaches this add, because it got jumped over in the beginning. Now obviously, infinite loops aren't great. Eventually we're going to need a way to only loop a certain number of times, but we'll solve that problem later. In Minecraft, let's put in jumps. I'll plug the bottom 10 bits into a mux with the program counter, and I'll make a new signal for it on the control ROM. When it's a jump, the PC will take the new address, so that's what this torch is for. Otherwise, the PC will take the current address plus 1, so no other instruction has a torch. Now we can run this counting program for real. I'll paste it in, speed the game up, and press clock. Just like we expected, it loops forever. You can see here that the PC just keeps going 0, 1, 0, 1. And if you look at register 1, it's continuously incrementing. This type of jumping, where you specify the address directly, is called direct jumping. But another common approach is called relative jumping, where you specify some kind of offset. For example, you can make jump 3 jump 3 forward instead of jumping directly to 3. You would just have to add 3 to the PC instead of setting the PC to 3. These two methods each have their own pros and cons. Hardware-wise, direct jumping is simpler because there's no calculation. It's just overwriting the program counter with a new number. Whereas relative jumping is slightly more complex because it has to add a number to the PC. However, relative jumping has a huge advantage when it comes to software. Take a look at this program, for example. It does some work at the start, executes some jumps, and then stops. If you're using direct jumping, then even if you add one more line of work to the start, all the jumps later on get messed up. they're all off by 1 now. But if you use relative jumping, then editing the start won't break anything. The jumps are relative, so they'll continue to jump by the same amount. For our computer though, we're going to actually continue to use direct jumping for everything. We'll see later in this series that the editing problem isn't really as big of a problem as it seems. So by adding jumps, we now have complete control over the PC. We can jump to a lower address to send it back, a higher address to send it forward, or even send it to the current address. Although I don't recommend that because it'll keep jumping to itself forever. But we still have a big problem. When it comes to loops, they're always infinite. There's no way to, for example, loop for 10 times and then stop. This is because the jump instruction is unconditional. It always does the same thing. No matter how far back you send the program counter, it'll eventually get to the same jump again and get sent back again. It would be really nice if we had some kind of conditional jump, one that only jumps if a certain condition is met. So, what kind of condition should we use? This is very debatable, and there's a ton of freedom here, but the most common conditions are based on the result of the ALU. Specifically, most ALUs actually have extra circuitry on them called flags. A flag is just a 1-bit register, true or false, and its job is to tell you information about the result. The 4 most common kinds of flags are 0, carry, negative, and overflow. The 0 flag is true if the result is 0, simple enough. The carry flag is true if the carryout, or the 9th bit in our case, is 1. And these last 2 flags are useful when you're dealing with signed numbers. I talked about signed numbers in episode 5 of LRR. The negative flag is true if the sign bit, or the 8th bit in our case, is 1. And the overflow flag is true if there was a signed overflow during the operation. Again, these 2 are only useful if you're working with signed numbers, and I personally feel like they're not nearly as important as 0 and carry. So we're actually only going to add a 0 flag and a carry flag to our computer. Let's go through this example program and watch how the flags behave. The registers will start with this, and by default, the flags will start as false. The first instruction adds 1 plus 1 and writes a 2. 2 is not 0, and there was no carry, so both flags are set to false. The XOR does 1 XOR 1 and writes a 0. So the 0 flag is true, but there was still no carry, so that's set to false. The next instruction adds 0 plus 255 and writes 255. Both flags get set back to false. And the last instruction does 1 plus 255, which overflows to 256 and writes a 0. So the 0 flag is true, and the carry flag is true too, because it overflowed and created a carry during the operation. Now, if this program had something like a no-op, it wouldn't really make sense to talk about the flags, because a no-op doesn't even use the ALU. So let's make it so that only instructions that actually use the ALU set the flags. This will be specified by a brand new column on the spreadsheet. All of these yellow instructions use the ALU, so let's mark them as setting the flags. And add immediate does too, so let's have that set flags as well. The rest of the instructions will not set the flags. So if you added some no-ops to the end of the program, the flags would continue to be true and true. It just leaves them alone. But if you added another XOR, for example, XOR uses the ALU, so the flags get set again. In this case, they get set to true and false. Let's build these flags in Minecraft. First, the 0 flag. This can be detected by ORing all the bits together into a single torch. That way, if the number is 0, the torch is on, otherwise the torch is off. Let's put this circuit onto the output of the ALU. And then the carry flag is just the carryout of the original adder. In our case, it's this lamp on top. So I'll just take the carryout and wire it to be next to the 0 signal. Then I'll plug both these signals into 1-bit registers. If an instruction has to set the flags, all it has to do is clock these repeaters. For example, let's say that the ALU calculates 1 plus 255. When you clock these repeaters, both flags are set to true. This signifies that the result was 0 and there was a carry. As another example, let's say the ALU calculates 1 XOR 1. Setting the flags again will make the 0 flag true and the carry flag false, signifying that the result was 0, but there was no carry. Okay, now that we have flags, we can finally make a conditional jump instruction. Introducing branch, with opcode 11 and mnemonic BRH. Branch has 2 operands, a 2-bit condition code and a 10-bit address. If the condition is true, it will jump to the address. Otherwise, it will do nothing. Since the condition code is 2 bits, let's have 4 possible conditions. 0 flag true, 0 flag false, carry flag true, and carry flag false. In assembly, let's signify the condition with one of these keywords. For example, branch 07 will assemble to this. When it's executed, it will only jump to 7 if the 0 flag is true. Otherwise, it'll do nothing. Similarly, we can write branch not 07, which assembles to this. When this is executed, it will only branch to 7 if the 0 flag is false. Otherwise, it'll do nothing. In hardware, implementing branch is simpler than you might think. Notice that this mux directly controls whether or not the PC increments or receives a new address from the instruction. Most instructions make it choose the increment, and the jump instruction makes it choose the new address. But for branch, we can't just choose one or the other. It depends on the condition. So what we'll do is plug the condition directly into this mux. For example, when executing branch 07, the 0 flag will be plugged into the mux. That way, if it's true, the PC gets a 7. Otherwise, the PC just counts up. Or when executing branch not 07, the inverse of the 0 flag will go into the mux. That way, if it's false, the PC gets a 7, and otherwise, it counts up. Alright, let's get a feel for how branch works in a program. This program is designed to loop 3 times and then stop. It starts by putting a 3 into register 1. Then it decrements register 1 to 2. And remember, decrement is secretly an add immediate, which sets the flags. Since the result was 2, the 0 flag gets set to false. Then we have branch 04. The 0 flag is false, so this does nothing. It doesn't take the branch. Then it jumps back up to here, decrements register 1 to 1, and the 0 flag gets set to false, so the branch is not taken again. Jump back up, decrement register 1 to 0, setting the 0 flag to true, and now the branch gets taken. It's a branch to halt, so the program stops. We've successfully looped 3 times. But this isn't the only way to make a loop. This program also loops 3 times, but it uses one less instruction thanks to a fancy trick. It starts by loading a 2 and decrementing it. This sets the flags to false and true. It's easy to see why 0 is false, that's just because the result was not 0, but why is carry true? Well, remember, decrement is secretly an add immediate with 255. So what really happened is 2 plus 255, which created a carry as it wrapped back around to 1. That's why the carry flag got set to true. So the branch gets taken, and we jump back up. Decrement to 0, take the branch again, and now notice that decrementing 0 sets the carry flag to false. It translates to 0 plus 255, which does not overflow. This means the branch is not taken, and we continue out to the halt. In both of these programs, the result is the same. We looped 3 times. The main difference is that in the first case, the branch was not taken during the loop and taken to exit the loop, whereas in the second case, the branch was taken during the loop and not taken to exit the loop. Alright, let's implement branching in Minecraft. First, we need to get the signals for the 4 conditions. Since we already have the flags, this is really easy. The first condition is just the 0 flag, the second is the 0 flag inverted with a torch, then it's the carry flag, and the carry flag inverted with a torch. These 4 signals display the 4 different conditions. Now we just have to choose the right condition based on the 2-bit condition code. To do this, we can build a 2 to 4 decoder and hook it up to select only one condition at a time. As you can see, if the code is 00, it chooses the first condition. If the code is 01, it chooses the second condition, etc. And that's basically all the hardware you need. Now that you have the right condition, you can just plug it into the mux whenever there's a branch. Let's hook this up and run a looping program on the real computer. If it runs correctly, then we should see the program counter go through this sequence. I'll paste the program in and start the clock. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Perfect. Another cool thing about these conditions is that they can give you information about the registers. For example, consider this code segment. It does register 1 minus register 2, and if the result is 0, it takes the branch. This means that if it takes the branch, you know for sure that register 1 equals register 2. If A minus B is 0, A has to equal B. And if the branch is not taken, well, you know they're not equal. And we can also get information from the carry flag. If you do A minus B and get a carry, then that means A was greater than or equal to B. I strongly recommend proving this to yourself by getting a subtractor and testing it out. So in this segment, if R1 is greater than or equal to R2, the branch gets taken. So let's add some more condition code notations to the assembler, just to make programming even easier. On top of using 0, not 0, carry, and not carry, you can now also use equals, not equals, greater than or equal to, or less than. They are equivalent notations. The new notation just makes sense when there's a subtraction directly before the branch. And it's actually so common to do a subtraction before a branch that I'm going to make a simple pseudo instruction for it called compare, or CMP. Compare Rx, Ry subtracts x minus y and writes it to register 0 to throw out the result. Compare R1, R2, for example, assembles to subtract R1, R2, R0. So now, let's say you want to see if register 5 is less than register 6. You can just do compare register 5, register 6, and branch less than. This assembles to a subtraction and a branch not carry. So if register 5 is indeed less than register 6, there won't be a carry and the branch gets taken. In the very first episode, I talked about Turing completeness, and I just want to mention that now that our computer has branching, it's officially Turing complete. Hi guys, and welcome back to Let's Make a Redstone Computer. Last episode, we added some instructions that made programming a lot easier, jump and branch. Today, we're going to continue to make programming easier by making a call stack. But first, I want to introduce a new assembly feature called labels. Labels allow you to use a word for an instruction address instead of a number. In our assembly language, they always start with a dot, and they get placed before the opcode. For example, consider this program. It starts by comparing register 1 to register 2, and if they're equal, it branches to the halt, skipping over the increment. But if they're not equal, it increments register 3, and then halts. Let's add a label named skip to line 3. Now, whenever you write .skip, the assembler will literally replace it with a 3. So on this line, you can just write .skip. When the program gets assembled, it'll get replaced with a 3 before becoming machine code, because that's what the value of .skip truly is. Okay, but why do this? Why make a label and then write the name of the label instead of just writing 3? Well, what if you wanted to add more code to the start of the program? If you did that, then 3 wouldn't be the right number for the branch anymore. You would need to fix it and make it point to the halt again. But if you use labels, this problem doesn't exist. The branch isn't pointing to a specific number anymore. It's pointing to a label, and the actual value of that label will change automatically, thanks to the assembler. Next, consider this Fibonacci program. We've seen Fibonacci programs before, but this one is cool because it uses a loop. Depending on what you set register 1 to in the beginning, it'll produce a different Fibonacci number in register 4. If you set register 1 to 1, register 4 will end with 1. Or if you set register 1 to 6, register 4 will end with 8. This program has 3 labels: fib, loop, and done. And thanks to these labels, you can put this code anywhere in the program and it'll still work. If you put it at the very beginning, then fib resolves to 0, loop resolves to 4, and done resolves to 10. Or if you put it later in the program, they'll resolve to something else. But the point is, it doesn't really matter what these labels resolve to. In fact, most of the time while you're programming, you won't even know what they resolve to, because you don't have to. All that really matters is that when you say something like jump label, it jumps to that label, wherever that may be. Okay, so hopefully it's clear by now that jumping and branching are super important for programming. They allow for things like if statements and loops. But as you get into the higher levels of programming, you might realize there's kind of a problem. Let me show you what I mean. Let's say you want the 4th Fibonacci number. Easy, just set register 1 to 3 and use the Fibonacci program. Then you write some more code, and then later on in the same program, you want another Fibonacci number. Let's say the 6th one. So you set register 1 to 5 and write the Fibonacci code again. This works, but now you have duplicated code, which is not a good idea for many reasons. One reason is because if you find a bug, you have to remember to change it in both places. That might not sound that bad, but what if there were 20 copies? It just gets really annoying, and you don't want to run the risk of forgetting to change one. Another reason is because duplicating code is a waste of space. Why should you have to say how to calculate a Fibonacci number again if it already did it before? That seems very inefficient. It would be much nicer if you could just write the Fibonacci code once and reuse it, or call it, every time you want a Fibonacci number. So let's introduce a new instruction called call, with opcode 12 and mnemonic CAL. Call is basically the same thing as jump. It takes one address as an operand, and when it's executed, it jumps to that address. So now, if you want the 4th Fibonacci number, you can do the following. Set register 1 to 3, and then do call fib. This jumps to wherever fib is located, and you'll get the 4th Fibonacci number, as normal. But after it finishes, we still need some way to return to where the call came from. So here's what we're going to do. When a call is executed, it's not just going to jump. It's also going to save where we left off in a special register called the return register. Specifically, it'll save the current address plus 1, because that's the address of the next instruction once we get back. So now, once the Fibonacci part is done, all we have to do is jump back to what's in the return register. To do this, let's introduce another new instruction called return, with opcode 13 and mnemonic RET. Return has no operands. All it does is jump to whatever is in the return register. Let's place a return at the end of the Fibonacci part, and now it'll jump back to where we left off. What we've just done is created a subroutine, a set of instructions that we can call to execute on demand and return back to where we were. And the amazing thing is, if you want another Fibonacci number later, you can just call the subroutine again. There's no need to duplicate code. Just like last time, it'll jump to fib, run it, and return. Let's look at another example of subroutines. In this program, there are two subroutines, one named add1 and another named add2. And then there's the main part of the program at the beginning. So let's go ahead and run this. The first instruction sets register 1 to 0, easy enough. The next instruction is a call to add 1. So it jumps to add 1 and saves the current address plus 1. Then the add immediate adds 1, and the return takes us back to whatever was saved, which is right here. Then there's a call to add 2, so it jumps to add 2, once again saving the current address plus 1. Then the add immediate adds 2, and the return takes us back. Then there's one more call to add 1, so once again it jumps to add 1, runs the add immediate, and returns to halt. After the program halts, register 1 has a 4. This makes sense because we just called add 1, then add 2, then add 1 again. Alright, let's make call and return in hardware. First, I'll make the return register over here on the left. On a call, the current address plus 1 should go into it. And the nice thing is, the current address plus 1 is available right here, so it's really easy to plug in. Then on a return, the output should go into the program counter. So I'll take the output and plug it into this mux, making our first three-way multiplexer. The program counter now has to choose between an increment, a jump, and a return. And in Minecraft, building this is honestly really straightforward. This is how I would make a return register, and it's very similar to all the other registers I've made so far. It's just a bunch of repeater locks stacked on top of each other. But before we put this on the real computer, you might have noticed that there's a problem. What if you tried to call a subroutine from within a subroutine? For example, what if you wanted to make a subroutine called outer, which calls the subroutine add1? Well, let's try it out. There are now two subroutines, add1 and outer, and in the main part of the program, there's just a single call to outer. At the start of execution, the call will jump to outer and save where we left off. Then there's a call to add1, which jumps to add1 and saves where we left off again. But hold on a second, that just overwrote what we already had in the return register. Now there's no way to get back to the main part. We screwed ourselves. So what if instead of having a return register, it was more of a return stack? Like a pile of return addresses that you could just keep throwing more onto. Let's try again with a stack and see what happens. We start with a call to outer, which jumps to outer and puts where we left off on the stack. Then we have a call to add1, which jumps to add1 and puts where that left off also on the stack. Then we have an increment and a return. But where should the return go? Should it go to the first thing that got saved or the second one? Well, it should probably go to the most recently placed thing on the stack, because that must have come from the most recent call. Now we're in business. Next, there's another return, which will look at the most recent thing again, taking us back out to the halt. Let's do another example. This time I'll make a subroutine called add3, which calls add1 and then add2. The first call jumps to add3, then it calls add1. Once add1 finishes, it returns to the top of the stack, which is here. Then it calls add2. Once add2 finishes, it returns to the top of the stack again, which is here. And then there's one last return, which again takes us to the top of the stack, which is back to the halt. Let's go ahead and update our computer to have a stack instead. Now, the call instruction looks like this. It jumps to the address and saves the current address plus 1 onto the stack, which is called a push. And the return instruction looks like this. It puts the top of the stack into the program counter and then removes it from the stack, which is called a pop. One thing to note here is that while stack is much better than a single register, there's still a limit. A stack is not infinite. For example, let's say you made a subroutine that calls itself. Now when you call it, it calls itself, which calls itself, which calls itself, on and on forever. Except it's not forever. Eventually the stack would run out of space, causing what's called a stack overflow. So for our computer, let's just make the stack 16 layers deep. Back in Minecraft, the easiest way to make a stack is with a bidirectional shift register, as seen in LRR number 8. If you imagine this as the top of the stack, then you can push to the stack by putting data here and shifting right. Push 1, push 2, push 3. Notice how 3 is the most recent push, so it's at the top of the stack. Then to pop the stack, shift left. Pop 3, pop 2, pop 1. Now, there are many different designs for a bidirectional shift register. The one I just showed is kind of the classic design. It's 3 blocks wide per cell, and it uses 2 sets of repeater locks, facing in opposite directions. When you shift right, it uses the top set of repeater locks, and when you shift left, it switches to the bottom set. Here's another design created by my friend Katari. This one is 2 blocks wide per cell, and it only uses 1 set of locks. Shifting right follows this pattern, and shifting left follows this pattern. Pretty clever. But if we want to use any of these for the real call stack, we're going to need to make each cell 10 bits instead of 1. Remember, instruction addresses are 10 bits long. So I'm just going to choose the classic design and stack it upwards to make 10 total layers. And this is the finished call stack. To test it out, let's go ahead and write a 7 and push it. Then I'll write a 10 and push it. And I'll write a 12 and push it. The top of the stack is reading a 12. That's a good sign because that's the last thing I pushed. And then pressing pop will pop the 12, showing 10. Pop the 10, and now it shows 7. Pop the 7, and the stack is back to empty. All we have to do now is hook this up to the computer following the diagram from earlier. And here's what that looks like. Everything should be good to go. Now, you might notice that the computer looks a little bit different from last time. The program counter is up here now, and the control ROM got shoved underneath. Don't worry about this, it's just because I'm starting to put the computer into its final layout, which looks like this. It still matches the diagram perfectly. So let's go ahead and run the add3 program from earlier. Assemble it, paste it in, and run. While it's running, you can actually see it pushing and popping from the stack, which is really cool. And once it's done, there's a 3 in register 1. Beautiful. Hi guys, and welcome back to Let's Make a Redstone Computer. In the last episode, we created a call stack. Today is a really exciting day. We're going to add the last main component and finish the instruction set. I hope you enjoy. At this point in the series, our computer is decently powerful. You can make programs over 1,000 instructions long, and these programs can have a wide variety of code structures, like if statements, loops, and subroutines. But it's not powerful enough. If you watch the showcase video for this computer, you know that the original reason I designed it was to run games, like Tetris. And to make games, we're going to need a lot more memory. So how should we add more memory? One idea is to just make the register file bigger. Maybe instead of 16 registers, there could be 100 or 1,000. Technically this is an option, but it comes at a cost. Remember, register operands are 4 bits long, because 4 bits can address 16 different registers. So even if you just added 1 more register, making the total 17, 4 bits wouldn't be enough anymore. Register operands would become 5 bits long, and you'd have to completely redo the instruction set. Okay, but then why did I spend all this time making the instruction set like this? I mean, if 16 registers isn't enough memory, why didn't I just start with a giant register file and design the instruction set based on that? Well, memory works best when it's not just one big register file, but rather a pyramid. Let me explain. Memory is a balancing act. We like when memory is big, but we also like it to be fast. This is problematic because as memory gets bigger, it gets slower. So how can you design memory to get the best of both worlds? The answer is a pyramid, or a hierarchy. For example, in the computer you're watching this on, the memory hierarchy probably looks something like this. On the bottom, you have a drive, like a solid-state drive or a hard disk drive. This stores a lot of data, so it's very slow. Above that, you probably have RAM, or main memory. Main memory can't store as much data, but it's a lot faster. Above that, there's the registers. These hold very little data, but they're extremely fast. Now of course, this diagram is not exact, but no matter what the exact layers are, your computer follows some sort of pyramid, where the memory types get smaller and faster as you go up. To understand why this setup works so well, I like to use an analogy with a library. Let's say you're a big reader, and there's a library that stores all the books you could ever want to read. So whenever you finish a book, one option is to just go to the library, return it, and get a new one, which takes about an hour. But a better option would be to have a bookshelf at home. Then you could go to the library, grab 20 books, and set them on the bookshelf. Now whenever you want a new book, you'll only spend a few minutes getting it from the shelf. Well, until you finish them all and need to go to the library again, but that'll only happen like once a week. But even this is not as efficient as it could be. You could also have a backpack that stores 3 books. Now whenever you want a new book, you'll only spend a few seconds getting it out of your backpack. You'll still have to go back to the bookshelf sometimes, but that'll only happen like once a day. This is why a hierarchy is so great. It makes most tasks very efficient and only slows down once in a while when you go to a lower layer. Now, for our computer, a memory pyramid is a bit less useful than it is in real life. Remember, our computer is single cycle, meaning every instruction takes the same amount of time, which means any memory we make is going to end up being the same speed in practice. But there are actually more advantages to a pyramid than just speed, So our computer is still going to have a pyramid. It'll be a mini pyramid that looks like this. The registers on the highest layer, and a new component called the data memory below that. The data memory will be much bigger than the registers, and in theory, it should be slower. But again, it's not actually slower because our computer is single cycle. So how will the data memory work? Well, just like the instruction memory, there will be a list of addresses. But instead of a 10-bit address, it'll be an 8-bit address, creating 256 possible slots. And instead of storing an instruction at each address, it'll store 1 byte of data. This data will end up being whatever we want, similar to the registers. In fact, if you want to think of the data memory as 256 new registers, you can. That's basically what it is. To write data to an address, just put the address here, the data here, set it to write, enable it, and clock it. Then to read data, just put the address you want to read here, set it to read, enable it, and whatever data is at that address will come out right here. Alright, let's make this in Minecraft. First, we need to make an 8 to 256 decoder. That way we can input an address and get a signal at the physical location. Next, let's make this input, a 1-bit signal to distinguish between a write and a read. I'll start by splitting every output into 2, one for writing and one for reading. Then I'll just make this signal control which one is allowed through. If it's on, then it's a write. So when an address comes in, it'll output a write at that address. And if it's off, it's a read. So it'll output a read at that address. Then for the actual storage, I'm just going to use the same design from the registers, duplicated up to 256 bytes. Honestly, this is a pretty lazy solution, but it's fine for a single cycle computer. So let's say you want to write a 5 into the data memory. Input the 5 right here, and it'll spread out in this tree formation. Now it's directly behind all the repeaters, so it's ready to be written to any address. To write to address 7, for example, input a 7 here, and clock it. Thanks to the decoder, this makes the byte at address 7 quickly unlock and relock, grabbing the 5. Now let's say you want to read the data memory. If you look closely, there's another tree formation for reading, which ORs all the outputs together. So if you switch to read mode and input 7, the 5 gets put onto this tree and it comes out on the final output. If you read any other addresses, the output will be 0, because all the other addresses currently have 0. Okay, so as you might have guessed, these last 2 instructions are how we're going to communicate with this new memory. One instruction will be for loading data from the data memory into a register, which is called load. This will have opcode 14 and mnemonic LOD. The other instruction will be for storing data from a register to the data memory, which is called store. This will have opcode 15 and mnemonic STR. Let's focus on load first. Load has 3 operands: register A, register B, and an optional third operand called offset. I say optional because if you don't include it, the assembler will just make it a 0. Register A is the pointer, and register B is the destination, meaning it'll look at the contents of register A and go to that number as an address in data memory. Then it'll take whatever's at that address and load it into register B. For example, load R2, R3 assembles to this, and when it's executed, it'll use register 2 as a pointer and load the data into register 3. If register 2 has a 1 in it, and the data at address 1 is, say, 6, then register 3 will get loaded with that 6. But this is all assuming you have an offset of 0. The 4-bit offset value is sine 2's complement, so it can be anything from -8 to 7. I talked about 2's complement in LRR number 5. And so actually, instead of using just register A for the pointer, it'll use register A plus the offset. For example, load R2, R3, 1 will use register 2 plus 1 as a pointer and load the data into register 3. Note that this does not change register 2. The offset is only used for the pointer. Let's make a simple program with loads to make this really solid. Let's say that addresses 1 through 4 of data memory look like this, and you want to load this data into the first 4 registers. There are kind of 2 ways to do this. One way is like this. Put a 1 into register 1, and then do load R1, R1. This uses register 1 as a pointer, which points to address 1, and loads the data into register 1. Then you can just do the same thing for register 2, 3, and 4. Another way to do it is like this. Put a 0 into an extra register, like register 15, and just use offsets to reach all 4. The first load uses register 15 plus 1 as a pointer, which points to 1, and loads it into register 1. The next load uses register 15 plus 2 as a pointer, which points to 2, and loads it into register 2. And similar story for 3 and 4. As you can see, using offsets saves instructions. It allows you to reach data in a small area without having to change the pointer. In hardware, we can support loads by hooking up the data memory like this. On a load, the ALU will calculate register A plus the offset and plug that in for the address. Whatever's at that address will come out and get selected on this MUX, and register B will be selected on this MUX, so it gets written to register B. Now let's transition to the final instruction, store. Store has the exact same operands as load, so it can be kind of confusing. Just remember, load is loading a register from the data memory, and store is storing a register to the data memory. So in a store, register A plus the offset is still the pointer, but register B is not the destination. Register B is the data you want to store to that pointer. For example, store R2 R3 1 assembles to this, and when it's executed, it'll use register 2 plus 1 as a pointer and store whatever's at register 3 to that address. If register 2 has a 1 in it and register 3 has a 6, it'll store the 6 to address 2. And in hardware, all we have to do to support store is take register B and plug it into the data input. Once again, the ALU will calculate register A plus the offset, and the contents of register B will be written to that address. You know the drill, let's go ahead and connect the data memory to the computer, following the diagram. And that looks like this. Everything should be connected. Now let's run a test program to showcase load and store. I think a perfect test program is bubble sort. This program will use the bubble sort algorithm to sort the list of numbers at the first 8 addresses. For example, if the addresses look like this at the start of the program, they'll look like this at the end. If you're interested, here's the equivalent pseudocode, so you can pause the video to learn how it works. I'll just manually put in some data at the first 8 addresses, paste it in, and run. After many trips back and forth between the data memory and the registers, the list is sorted. Even though this is not the end of the series, the main part of the computer is completely done, and the instruction set is finished. We have all 16 instructions. But from an outside perspective, it still doesn't do much. It can run programs, but ultimately it's just a box changing its memory. So in the next episode, we'll talk about how to connect this to the outside world, like a screen or a controller. And then after that, the final episode will be about programming, because even after the computer is hooked up to stuff, there's still a lot to talk about when it comes to complicated programs. But yeah, at this point in the series, you've learned how all the essential parts of a computer work. So go out there and try to make your own. Hi guys, and welcome back to Let's Make a Redstone Computer. In the last episode, we finished the main part of the computer and the instruction set. But even with all this hardware and software, everything is still very contained. The computer is basically just a box that changes its memory. So today, we're going to talk about input and output. I hope you enjoy. Just like everything else in this series, input and output introduces a ton of freedom. There are unlimited ways to connect a computer to the outside world. But even with all this freedom, most approaches can fit into 2 main categories: port-based I/O and memory-mapped I/O. Let's talk about port-based I/O first. This approach, also known as isolated I/O, is where you use ports to talk to external devices. A port is basically just another register, and you can think of it as separate from the main CPU. In general, you can have as many ports as you want, but to keep things simple for this example, let's say you have 4 ports. Now if you want to send some data to the outside world, just write it to a port. You can write a 7 to port 1, or a 3 to port 2, whatever you want. Then the devices on the outside can read the ports to access the data. For example, maybe one of your devices is a number display. In that case, you could just have it read port 1 and display the 7. And if a device wants to send data to the CPU, like with a controller, just do the reverse. Have the device write the data to a port, and now the CPU can read it. This approach is nice because the ports are a physical, intermediate layer between the CPU and the devices. The CPU can see the ports, but it can't talk to the devices directly. And the devices can see the ports, but can't talk to the CPU directly. But the downside of this approach is that you need extra instructions to talk to the ports. For example, if we added ports to our computer, we would probably need at least one more instruction. Maybe an instruction called port that takes in a register, a port address, and a bit to signify if you're loading from the port or storing to the port. Another idea is to have 2 instructions, port load and port store. This works too. The point is, since ports are a separate piece of hardware, the instruction set needs separate instructions to talk to them, or at the very least, a separate argument within an existing instruction. Now let's talk about the other category, memory-mapped I/O. The idea behind memory mapping is to use the memory already in the CPU to directly talk to devices. For example, let's say you have a number display. Specifically, it takes in an 8-bit number and shows it on these 3 digits. To connect this to the CPU using memory mapping, you can take an address from data memory, like address 255, and directly plug it in. Whatever is at that address will now show up on this display. For example, if you store a 13 to address 255 using this program, the device shows 13. We've basically hijacked this address. As another example, let's say you have an 8x8 screen. It takes in any 8x8 pattern in the back and shows it on these pixels. You could hook this up to the computer by taking the last 8 addresses of data memory, 248 to 255, and plugging them in. Each column of the screen is now showing the data from each address. For example, if you store 1 through 8 using this program, you can literally see the data. Or if you store these numbers using this program, you'll get a smiley face. Memory mapping is nice because you don't need to change the instruction set whatsoever. Assuming the devices are directly connected to data memory, you can just use load and store. But the downside is that it takes up space in memory. In this case with the screen, these 8 addresses are essentially reserved. You can't use them for anything other than the screen, because if you do, it'll mess up what's on the screen. So which strategy should we use? Should we create ports? Should we use memory mapping? Or should we do something else? Well, when I made this computer the first time, I thought about this a lot, and I eventually decided to use memory mapping. So that's what we're going to make in this series. If you're making your own computer, this might not be the best choice for you. Make sure to consider ports as well, because that might be better for your situation. But yeah, for our computer, we're going to create a memory mapped system. Specifically, we're going to reserve the last 16 addresses of data memory, 240 to 255, for input and output. One cool thing about having 16 is that you can easily access all of them using offsets. Remember from last episode that the offset value for loads and stores is -8 to 7. So if you use 248 as a pointer, then offset -8 will reach 240, all the way to offset 7 reaches 255. Then in terms of devices, we're going to add 5. A controller, a random number generator, a number display, a character display, and a giant 32 by 32 screen. I just picked these devices because they seemed useful for making games. To connect these devices to the computer, we need to create a protocol, or a system of rules so that everything knows how to talk to each other. The protocol is something that you, as the designer, need to come up with. There's really no right or wrong way to make a protocol. All that matters is that it makes sense to you. For our protocol, we're going to keep track of it with another spreadsheet. There are 16 rows, one for each address, and they're color-coded according to the devices. This column shows the devices, and this column shows the address. Then there's a column called functionality, which I need to explain. As I've described memory mapping so far, the CPU can both store to an address and load from an address as normal. But in reality, this is pretty difficult to wire. So we're actually going to make each address either store only, where the CPU can only output data to it, or load only, where the CPU can only read the data as input. And so that's what this column is for. It'll just tell you which addresses are store only and which are load only. Then there's the name, which is pretty self-explanatory. There's a holds column to describe what this address is supposed to hold, and then the last 2 columns describe what happens on a store and what happens on a load. If this doesn't all make sense right now, I think it'll be a little more clear when we start to fill it in. So first, let's make the controller. Since this computer is meant for games, let's make the controller have a D-pad for up, left, down, and right, and 4 buttons for A, B, start, and select. I'll combine these signals into an 8-bit wire. 8 bits is the perfect amount for just one address, so let's reserve address 255 for the controller, and I'll just plug these 8 bits directly into that address. So now, if you load from 255, the 8 bits you get signify which things on the controller are being pressed. If you load and get this string, for example, then you know that up and left are being pressed. On the spreadsheet, let's label address 255 as load only, the name is controller input, and it holds the controller info. And on a load, it simply loads that controller info. It doesn't do anything on a store because it's load only. If you try to store to it, that store will go nowhere. One problem with this though is that a button press is very short, meaning when you load, it can be difficult to actually capture it. So I'm going to plug these 4 buttons into some SR latches before they reach the address. That way when you press a button, it stays on. Once there's a load from 255, this wire will reset the latches. This makes it much easier to capture button presses from the player. Trust me, you'll have a very hard time without it. Next, let's add a random number generator. I chose to add this because randomness is a huge part of making games. In Tetris, you want a random piece. In Snake, you want a random apple. You get the idea. In Minecraft, one of the easiest ways to generate randomness is with a binary randomizer. This circuit will give a random 1 or 0 when I press this button. It's a 50-50 chance. So if you have 8 of them, it'll create a random 8-bit number. However, these randomizers use droppers and hoppers, which are usually fine, but in the next episode, we're going to use a special tool to speed up the game, and that tool does not support these blocks. So I'm going to use this circuit to create randomness instead. This is called a linear feedback shift register. It's 8 bits tall, so when I press this button, a random 8-bit number is generated. The details of this circuit are not important for this video, but the idea is that using a shift register and some XOR gates, you can generate decently good randomness. And those components are easily created with your basic dust, repeaters, and comparators. No special blocks required. So let's connect this circuit directly to address 254, just like the controller on address 255. Now when you load from 254, this wire will generate a random number, and you'll receive it on the load. So on the spreadsheet, address 254 is load only again, the name is RNG, it holds a random 8-bit number, and on a load, it loads that random 8-bit number. Next up, the number display. This is similar to the device I was showing earlier. It takes in any 8-bit number and displays it. But it also has another input to switch between sign mode and unsigned mode. For example, if you input this and it's on unsigned mode, it'll show 203. But if it's on signed mode, it'll interpret it using 2's complement and show -53. This device also has a switch to clear the number. When you flick this lever, it forces all the lamps to be off. So I'm going to reserve these 4 addresses for the number display, 250 to 253, and all 4 of them will be store only. The CPU can store data to them, but can't load the data back. Address 250 will be for storing the number you want to show, and therefore the contents of address 250 will be directly connected to the display. For example, if you store a 7 to address 250, the display will show 7. Now, not all programs will need to use this display. Sometimes it's just better to have it turned off. So I'm going to use address 251 as a way to turn off the number display. If you store anything to address 251, it will detect that store and turn off the display. Notice that the holds column for this address is empty, because the contents don't matter. I'm just using this address for the store signal. Similarly, I'm going to use the store signal of address 252 and 253 to switch between sign mode and unsigned mode. If you store anything to 252, it'll switch to sign mode, and if you store anything to 253, it'll switch to unsigned mode. Here's an example program to hopefully make this more clear. It starts by storing a 200 to address 250, so the display shows 200. Then it increments the 200 and stores to 250 again, so the display updates to 201. Then there's a store to 252, which changes it to sign mode, so the display updates to -55. Another store to 253, which changes it back to unsigned mode. A store to 251, which clears the display, and then an increment and another store to 250, so it turns back on and shows 202. Okay, but this is an annoying program to read, right? You basically have to memorize the protocol to understand what's going on. So I'm going to add something called definitions to the assembler. That way the programmer can make things more clear. A definition is just a way to represent a number with a word. In my assembly language, if you say define apple 3, then every time you write apple, it'll be replaced with a 3. So to clean this up, let's define the word base pointer as 248, and let's define the names of the 4 ports as the 4 offsets. Now when you put these definitions into the program, it's much easier to read, and it assembles to the exact same thing. Next is the character display. In a typical character display, the characters show up one by one as you type them. And that's fine for most things, but when it comes to games, it would be nice to write a message instantaneously. So this character display is special. When you send characters to it, they don't get written to the screen. Instead, they get written to a secret buffer behind the screen, which the player can't see. Then when you want to display it, you can press this button to copy the buffer to the screen, making the entire message appear at once. For example, let's write the message subscribe. As you can see, it's not on the screen, it's in the buffer. It's only visible once you press this button to push the buffer. Now there's also a button to clear the buffer, so if you want to display a new message, you can do the following. Clear the buffer, write the new message, and push the buffer again. The screen will immediately update to the new message. And if you ever want to clear the display completely, just clear the buffer and push it. On the spreadsheet, there will be 3 addresses for the character display, 247 to 249, and they're all store only. Address 247 will hold the 8-bit code for the character, and on a store, it'll write the character to the buffer. Now, the types of characters you can write depends on what character set you're using. For our computer, I just made this simple character set with 30 characters. You can use a different character set if you're making your own computer. And to make programming easier, I made some inbuilt definitions for them in the assembler. If you type a single character and wrap it in quotes, it'll automatically assemble to that character code. LDI R1 quote A will put the code for A into register 1. Then address 248 will be for pushing the buffer, and address 249 will be for clearing the buffer. Let's go ahead and make a program to write something. I'll write the message hello. First, grab 247 for the pointer, then load H into register 1 and store it. Do the same thing for E, L, L, and O, and then store to 248 to push the buffer. Last but not least, let's add the screen. This screen has an X coordinate, a Y coordinate, a draw pixel button, and a clear pixel button. And just like the character display, the draws and clears are done in a buffer, not the actual screen. For example, if you input 2, 3, and press draw, it'll turn on that pixel at that coordinate in the buffer. And then just like before, there's a signal to push the buffer and a signal to clear the buffer. If you push it right now, you'll see the pixel we wrote at 2, 3. Then if you clear the buffer and push it again, the screen gets cleared. So the screen will reserve 7 memory addresses, 240 to 246. And this time, they're not all store only. I'll get to that in a second. Addresses 240 and 241 are to hold an X coordinate and a Y coordinate. And since the coordinates are 5 bits each, only the bottom 5 bits will be plugged in. Then address 242 will use the write signal to draw a pixel in the buffer, and address 243 will use the write signal to clear a pixel in the buffer. Then address 245 will push the buffer, and address 246 will clear the buffer. Let's look at a quick example. This program stores 2 for X and 3 for Y into the coordinates. Then it stores to draw pixel, which will draw the pixel at 2, 3 in the buffer. Then it pushes the buffer, then it updates Y to 4 and draws that pixel. Then it pushes the buffer again, and finally it clears the buffer and pushes it again. The only other address, 244, you'll notice is load only. That's because it's an input. We're going to take the pixel at these coordinates from the screen buffer and plug it back into the bottom bit of this address. For example, if these are the current coordinates and the buffer looks like this, then when you load address 244, the bottom bit will be on. It might seem weird to do this, but reading pixel values is super useful, especially when making games. If you're making Tetris, for example, it's nice to read the pixels underneath the piece, because if they're on, the piece hit the ground. Another way to think about this is that the screen buffer has now become another piece of memory for the computer. You can write data to it or read from it. So what makes it different from any other piece of memory? And with that, the protocol is done and all the devices are hooked up. I know I went over a lot in this video, but I want to stress once again that this protocol is just how I personally designed it. There are many other ways to do this. And on top of that, there are many different devices and features you could potentially add. You could add a sprite drawer to the screen, you could add a keyboard, you could even connect another computer. Why not? As long as the protocol makes sense to you and the devices know how to use it, you're good to go. Our computer is just one example of a working system. Hi guys, and welcome back to the final episode of Let's Make a Redstone Computer. In the last episode, we completely finished all the hardware, so today is about software. We're gonna make some cool programs and show off what this computer can do. I hope you enjoy. Before jumping into programming though, let's go over how our assembly language works in detail, because there are some things I haven't mentioned in this series yet. In general, every instruction is written as an opcode followed by the operands, and the order of these arguments is the exact same between assembly and machine code. Now, technically, you can just write decimal numbers for everything. 2, 1, 2, 3 will assemble to add R1, R2, R3. But the better approach is to use symbols. The symbol for opcodes is a 3-letter mnemonic, and the symbol for registers is R followed by that number. Then for immediate values, like the 4 in LDI R14, you can write them in decimal, or in binary using the 0b prefix, or in hex using the 0x prefix, as long as the length of the immediate is correct. There are also symbols for the condition codes of a branch. Here are all the ways to write the 0 flag false condition, 0 flag true, carry flag false, and carry flag true. Remember, these equality-based ones only make sense when there's a compare, or a subtraction, directly before the branch. And then there's also some symbols for input and output. If you write a single character from this character set and wrap it in quotes, it'll assemble to its character code. Capitalization doesn't matter because the character set only has one version of A through Z. And if you write the name of any address, 240 to 255, from the name column with underscores between the words, it'll assemble to that address. For example, LDI R1 clear screen buffer will put 246 into register 1. On top of symbols, our assembly language also has labels, definitions, and comments. Labels always have a dot as their first character, and they can be written before the opcode or on their own line. In the case that a label is on its own line, it assembles to the next instruction below. In this program, for example, add them assembles to 2 because the next available instruction, add, has address 2, and then stop still assembles to 3. Definitions are similar to labels, but this time they have to be on their own line, and they always follow this syntax. Define, word, number. For example, if you say define myval4, then myval will assemble to 4. You can think of it as creating a new symbol. And by the way, definitions don't have to be at the beginning. They can be anywhere in the program. In this program, for example, there's a define right in the middle. This works fine, and you can still use this new symbol anywhere in the program, even above where you defined it. The assembler is smart enough to figure out all the symbols first, and then fill them in. And then comments are just a way to make a note without affecting the actual program. To write a comment, just type a slash, and then the rest of your message. Everything after that slash will be ignored. Now, you don't have to memorize any of what I just said to make a program. All the rules and specifications I just described can be found on the README of the project linked in the description. This README is super useful. I highly recommend reading through it. On top of describing the assembly, it also has the final instruction set spreadsheet, including IO and pseudo instructions, and it shows you how to create and run your own program. To create a program, simply create a new text file, change the extension from .txt to .as, open it in your favorite text editor, and start coding. That's it. Then to run a program, there are 2 options. The one I recommend is to use the simulator created by Ado. Once you've opened the simulator, you can just drag a program in and press the start button to run it. You can also change the speed, step line by line, and view the memory components as it's running. It's basically a simulator and a debugger in one. The other option is to actually run it on the Minecraft computer. I'll warn you though, the instructions for this are more complicated, and Minecraft is incredibly slow. Even if you speed up the game with tick rate, chances are it just won't be enough. The only real solution to run programs in Minecraft is to use a tool called MCHPRS. This is a custom server that rewrote Redstone to be much faster, allowing you to reach insane speeds. All the information to do this is on the README, but again, I recommend just using the simulator because it's easy. Alright, let's finally make some programs. I'll start super simple and make a Hello World program, a program that just prints Hello World to the display. First, I'll clear the character buffer in case there's anything in it from a previous program. I can do this by loading the address for clear character buffer and storing anything to it. In this case, I'm storing register 0, which always stores 0. Then I'll load the address for write characters, load the character code for H, store it, load the character code for E, store it again, and repeat this for every character in Hello World. And finally, I'll push the character buffer so that it shows up on the screen. As you can see from the simulator, running this program writes Hello World to the display. And of course, it does in Minecraft as well. Now let's do something more interesting. I want to make a program that has a bouncing ball. Specifically, this program has a single pixel on that travels diagonally and bounces off the walls when it hits them. I'll start by assigning 4 registers to keep track of the ball. Register 1 and register 2 for the X position and Y position, and register 3 and register 4 for the X velocity and Y velocity. Now, since this ball can only travel diagonally, these velocities will either be 1 and 1, 1 and -1, -1 and 1, or -1 and -1. And for the starting values, let's just make the position 25 and the velocity 1, 1. Then for the actual logic, we need to do something like this. On every frame, check if the ball hit a wall by checking its coordinates, and update the velocity as necessary. Then, add the velocity to the position, which moves the ball 1 step forward. And finally, draw the ball. So first, to make a loop, I'll just make a label called loop, and then I'll put the instruction jump loop at the end. That way, whatever code we put here will be repeated indefinitely. Now, to check if the ball hit the wall, notice that you can treat X and Y separately. Starting with X, if it's 0 or 31, then the ball is either in the leftmost column or the rightmost column. In both cases, the X velocity needs to be flipped, either from 1 to -1 or -1 to 1. So I'll check if X is 0 by comparing to register 0, and I'll check if it's 31 by putting 31 into register 5 and comparing to register 5. If either of these branches are taken, it'll jump to here, which flips the X velocity using a subtraction. 0 minus 1 becomes -1, and 0 minus -1 becomes 1. And then for Y, it's the same idea. If the Y coordinate is 0 or 31, the Y velocity needs to be flipped. So again, I'll compare it to 0 and 31, and if either of the branches are taken, it'll flip the Y velocity. Then I'll add the velocities to the positions using some add instructions. And finally, we just need to draw the ball. This can be split up into 3 main steps. Draw the ball on the buffer, push the buffer to the screen, and then clear the buffer for next time. By repeating these 3 steps, it'll continuously redraw the ball on every frame. And that's it. Running this program gives you a ball that bounces off the walls. And what's kinda cool is that by changing the start position, you can get different patterns. Starting at 1-1 bounces between the 2 corners, but starting at 4-7 looks like this. Okay, let's turn up the complexity even more and make a paint program. This program will have a cursor that you can move around with the D-pad. Pressing select will toggle drawing mode, which as you can see draws at the cursor, and pressing start will toggle erase mode, which erases at the cursor. I'll start by reserving registers 1 and 2 to keep track of the cursor position, register 3 for the draw mode toggle, and register 4 for the erase mode toggle. These toggles will be 0 if the toggle is off, or 255 if the toggle is on. I'm also going to put in some definitions for the offsets of all the I/O ports, and use register 15 as the base pointer. These all have the word port added to their names because I didn't want to make a conflict with the regular name, which as I said earlier, assembles to the direct address. Sorry, kinda confusing. But anyways, for the actual logic, let's do something like this. On every frame, if select is pressed, toggle the draw register. Then if that register is toggled on, draw on the screen at the cursor. And if start is pressed, toggle the erase register. And again, afterwards, if it's toggled on, erase on the screen at the cursor. And then if the D-pad is pressed, update the cursor position, and finally, draw the cursor. Just like before, I'll start off by making a basic loop. Then, to see if select is pressed, I'll load the controller input and do a bitwise AND with the bit for select. If you haven't seen this before, a bitwise AND can be used to selectively keep certain bits. If you take any bit string and do a bitwise AND with a second bit string, then the columns with 1 keep the original bits, and the columns with 0 delete them. So by doing a bitwise AND with the bit for select, I'm essentially keeping that bit and throwing out everything else. Therefore, if it's not 0, I know for sure that select is pressed. So I'll make a branch 0 to skip over this section, that way if it's not 0, it'll hit this toggle. After that, if the toggle is on, I'll make it draw at the cursor, assuming the cursor coordinates are already stored. Then to see if start is pressed, I'll just use the same strategy. Load the controller info, do a bitwise and toggle it if it's being pressed. And after that, if the toggle is on, it'll erase at the cursor. Next, we need to update the cursor coordinates according to the D-pad. To do this, I'll load the controller info one more time and use another bitwise AND to keep the last 4 bits. If left is on, I'll decrement register 1, which remember is the X coordinate. If down is on, I'll decrement register 2, which is the Y coordinate. If right is on, I'll increment register 1, and if up is on, I'll increment register 2. And that should update the cursor perfectly. Store it to pixel X and pixel Y. The last thing to do is draw the cursor. This will follow the same 3 steps from earlier. Draw it in the buffer, push the buffer, and clear it from the buffer. But the thing is, making a cursor on a screen with just 2 colors is kinda hard. You can make the cursor an on pixel, but this can be confusing because you can't tell it apart from any other on pixel. So I'm gonna do something interesting. I'm gonna make the cursor by inverting these 4 pixels. That way, the cursor is always different from its surroundings. And with this in mind, it turns out that 2 of these 3 steps are actually the same thing now. Drawing the cursor and clearing the cursor can both be done with an inversion. So I'm just gonna make a giant subroutine to invert those 4 pixels. And now I can just call it, push the buffer, and call it again. And with that, the paint program is done. That concludes all the programs I'm going to go through. I hope this gave you some insight on how to make your own. If you want to see more, just join my Discord and check out the CPU Programs channel. You'll see things like calculators, Tetris, Flappy Bird, 2048, asteroids, Minesweeper, and so much more. And the beautiful thing is, now that you know how the instruction set works, you could theoretically reverse engineer any of these programs. I know I've talked about Tetris a few times in this series, and if you're wondering, it's about 900 instructions long. But anyways, with that, the computer series comes to a close. If you've made it this far, give yourself a gigantic pat on the back. You've seen how every common part of a computer works, and not just from a truth table, but how the actual logic is built. You've seen how to create an instruction set, and how the machine code of an instruction leads to executing it in hardware. And now you've seen how to use an assembly language to make powerful programs. I know I've said this 1,000 times, but I really encourage you to go out there and make your own computer. Chances are it'll be fun. And best of all, when you get to your first computer architecture class in school, you'll get to flex on everyone that you've already made one. Thank you again to Capo and Sloime for all your help with the design of this computer. Thank you to Ado for creating the simulator. Thank you to all the miscellaneous help I've received in my Discord.